What happens when a people forget the one who carried them through deserts, who split seas for them, who gave them bread from heaven? What happens when memory fades and comfort becomes stronger than gratitude? These are not just ancient questions. They are questions for every human soul that has ever felt the pull of comfort over faith, of convenience over remembrance. Have you ever wondered how quickly we forget the very things we once prayed for, the blessings we once begged to receive? The story begins in the stillness of the land. Imagine the hills of Canaan painted gold by the evening light. Villages stand quietly, smoke rising from clay ovens, children laughing in courtyards, and the sound of cattle fading into the distance. For the first time in generations, there is no desert wandering. The people of Israel have arrived at the place long promised, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their tents are replaced by homes, their hunger by harvest, and their cries of battle by the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. Peace has a sweetness to it, but hidden inside that sweetness lies a danger one far greater than the sword of any enemy. When life grows gentle, memory grows dim. The God who delivered them from Egypt begins to fade from their hearts, not in a single night, but slowly, like a lamp burning out as oil runs low. One family forgets to tell their children the stories of the Red Sea. Another chooses to honor the gods of their neighbors, thinking it will help their crops grow. Small choices, quiet compromises, until the land of covenant is filled with shrines. To idols, the people who once vowed, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey Him," begin to bow before wooden images that cannot speak, cannot see, cannot move. And here lies the hook of the story, the mystery of human forgetfulness. How can a people who walked through parted waters forget the roar of the sea behind them? How can a nation that saw fire on the mountain turn instead to worship carved stones? But then again, do we not do the same? How often do we chase the glitter of wealth and call it security? How often do we worship at the altar of success, of power, of reputation, forgetting the very source of life itself? The idols may not be carved in stone for us, but they are carved in the corners of our hearts. The book of Judges opens not with victory, but with forgetting. It is not the kind of forgetting that comes from old age or lost memory. It is the forgetting that comes when comfort dulls our need for God, when everything we once longed for has been given to us, and we begin to believe we earned it ourselves. The fields are green, the rivers full, and the people whisper to themselves, "We are safe. Now we can take care of ourselves." And so the cycle begins the slow drift away from the one who gave them everything. Pause for a moment and imagine yourself walking down a path in Canaan as night falls. The stars appear above, countless and bright. In the distance, you hear faint songs rising from a hilltop, but they are not songs to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are chants to Baal, the god of storms, and Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility. At first, it seems strange, even shocking. But slowly, you notice that many of your neighbors have joined in. The voices grow louder, and soon it feels as if you are the only one who remembers the true God. This is how forgetting works, not in silence, but in the noise of other voices, other priorities, other loves. And perhaps this is why the story of Judges is not just history, it is a mirror. The land without a king becomes the heart without a center. The people of Israel stand as a reminder that forgetting is the most dangerous enemy of all. When God is forgotten, everything else begins to unravel. Laws lose their weight, families lose their strength, and the soul of a nation grows restless. Yet, in this forgetting, there is still hope. Because the God of Israel is not like the idols, He does not abandon easily. His silence is never the end. His absence is only the beginning of longing. As Israel drifts, God waits. And in that waiting, a story begins, a story of cycles, of falling and rising, of sorrow and redemption. A story that whispers not only to the past, but to every restless heart listening tonight. And so the stage is set. A land at peace but drifting into danger. A people blessed but blinded by comfort. A forgotten God, and yet a God who has not forgotten them. Before we go further into this story, let me invite you to be part of this journey with me. If you are listening now, take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the rest of this unfolding story. And I would love to know where you are listening from. Share your name and city in the comments below, and tell me what time it is where you are right now. Imagine people all across the world, in different places and times, all listening together to this same story. The night is young, the story has only begun, and already a quiet mystery lingers. What happens when a people forget their God? As dusk crept over the land, the hills of Canaan were bathed in soft evening light, their outlines blending into blue and purple hues. Dust rose from the worn paths beneath the shepherds as they gathered their flocks from the open fields. In the village courtyards, small fires started to flicker, their smoke drifting languidly into the cool sky. From afar, you could hear the hum of families cooking dinner, the gentle voices of mothers calling their kids home, and the laughter of young children running barefoot after one another until the last glimmer of light disappeared. The land appeared, serene at first glance, gentle, even tranquil. However, beneath that serenity was a silent void, the lack of a ruler or a guiding hand. There would be no unifying factor if there was no leadership. Although the country appeared to be one, it was actually fragmented, with every family, tribe, and individual traveling in accordance with their own wishes. Everyone followed their own instincts. Without a ruler, no chains, and no one to tell you what to do, it may initially seem like freedom. However, unguided freedom is brittle and quickly devolves into anarchy. Israel was adrift, each hand reaching for its own share, each heart tugged by its own hunger. Like a herd of sheep without a shepherd scattering across valleys and hillsides. Consider a village at dusk where neighbors congregate in small groups to talk about disagreements. While one man raises his voice to defend his own claim, another maintains that his method of allocating the land is just. Louder voices are all that are needed until someone leaves with a grudge and the burden of unresolved conflict. There is no judge to settle the dispute or king to establish order. A family in a different house bows down to a stone idol, believing it will bless their harvest. Another family next door declines, clinging to their Yahweh stories but being helpless to repulse their neighbors. Every household turns into its own kingdom, with convenience rather than covenant guiding every choice. In this situation, the leadership's silence poses a greater threat than any foreign army, because confusion spreads like night across the hills when no one is there to guide. It starts with trivial issues, like whose sheep graze where or whose voice is heard more often in arguments, but it soon permeates deeper issues. Who defines truth, and what does it mean? Who upholds justice, and what does it entail? Without a king, morality yields to the will of the most powerful voice. Justice becomes optional, and truth becomes negotiable. Consider it in the modern world. What takes the place of guidance when it is absent? The loudest voice, or possibly the most practical one, is followed when there are no more reliable voices. The flock scatters rather than remains motionless in the absence of a shepherd. It is evident in societies with failing leaders, disintegrating institutions, and a moral compass that is wildly erratic and lacks a true north. Division becomes its constant companion, and confusion becomes its silent ruler. Everyone constructs their own conception of what is morally correct, and before long, nobody can agree on anything. The land of Canaan was supposed to be a place of covenant, where the people would be bound together in harmony by God's law. However, every evening as the sun set, the sound of worship emanated from numerous altars. Some raised their voices in remembrance of their father's God, Yahweh. Others turned to Baal in the hopes that their fields would be blessed by the storm god. Others just drifted, submitting to whatever deity offered a simpler life at the time. Once bound together by a covenant with the living God, the land had devolved into a patchwork of allegiances, each of which was pulling in a different direction. Nevertheless, life continued. Weddings were celebrated, funerals were lamented, children were born and raised, the wheat was harvested, and the grapes were turned into wine. Life appeared normal, even flourishing from the outside. However, the people's souls were restless. In the absence of a shepherd and a king, only a thin layer of peace concealed the underlying fissures. The sense that something essential was missing, the weight of uncertainty pressing down, was almost palpable during quiet moments. Imagine a burden, man's shadow extending far across the ground as he makes his way home at dusk. He sees fields that ought to serve as a reminder of God's promises, but all he senses is the pull of his own desires. Without a leader to bring both men to justice, resentment festers in his heart as he considers his neighbor who wronged him. Because everyone else is praying for rain, a woman nearby prays to her neighbor's idol rather than to the God of Israel. Without leadership, people's hearts stray to whatever feels right at the time, and the thread that ties them together gradually starts to fall apart. The peril of a nation without a monarch is not the existence of a clamorous uprising, but rather the gradual breakdown of unity, the gradual deterioration of the covenant, and the slow but constant pull of forgetfulness. Everything disperses in the absence of a center. Lies proliferate in the absence of a voice of truth. Even the most resilient flock becomes prey in the absence of a shepherd. And the cycle had already started, even though the Israelites could not yet see it. One could easily assume that this is a story from a bygone era, a remote tale of an ancient people. However, the mirror becomes visible if you take a moment to stop. How often do we live our lives solely based on what we believe to be right? How often do we base our decisions on convenience rather than faith, or on preference rather than decay? Truth. A world without direction is a representation of every heart that forgets its king, not just Israel's past. There is beauty and peril in Canaan's dusk. Beauty because the fields were full, the homes were safe, and the land was rich. Danger because where leadership ought to have been, there was a gap beneath that silent exterior. Everyone followed their own moral convictions, but in the absence of a real king, what appears to be right can gradually turn into disaster. And as night descended farther over the hills, The populace was still unaware of how easily the tranquility they valued could be lost. Only the warmth of their homes, the gentleness of twilight, and the delusion of freedom to follow their own path without fear of repercussions were familiar to them. The story of Israel in the book of Judges repeats itself in a cycle, much like the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. Softly, almost imperceptibly, it starts. The people let their hearts roam, content and at peace. They fail to remember the God who led them through the desert, who subdued Egypt's might, and who opened rivers and seas for them. Like the last rays of evening, their devotion gradually wanes until idolatry taints their worship and compromise takes the place of their obedience. Silently, sin creeps in, grows stronger, and eventually becomes the undercurrent that drags them away, and the land itself feels heavy when sin takes hold. Their enemies appear as a reflection of their disobedience, sometimes abruptly and other times gradually. From the outside, foreign countries invade their villages, steal their crops, and degrade their soldiers. The once confident people retreat as fear spreads throughout the country, questioning why their strength has vanished. Their hearts start to ache with longing during these oppressive times as they remember the God they had forgotten. They cry out with the frantic groans of a people who realize they cannot save themselves, not with beautiful prayers or well-crafted words. The deliverance follows. Their cries are heard by the merciful God. He doesn't ignore their shattered voices. Rather, He appoints a judge, a regular person selected to bear His authority and grant His people freedom. The cycle repeats itself. Suffering results from sin. Repentance results from repentance. Mercy results from mercy. And deliverance results from mercy. Like the tide, it constantly comes and goes, rolling in and out. This cycle might appear far away, like the story of a different people in a different era. However, you might be able to hear the rhythm in your own life if you pay close attention. How frequently do we start down paths of forgetfulness and make decisions that appear minor at first, but gradually pull us away from what we know is right? How frequently do those decisions become burdensome and ensnare us in unintended consequences? Even so, how many times have we found ourselves pleading for help not in pretentious terms, but in plain, heartbreaking honesty in the midst of that burden? Save me. I can't accomplish this by myself. And we find mercy waiting, just like the Israelites did. The God who never deserts His people intervenes once more. He may not send a warrior to defeat an army on our behalf, but He meets us in equally potent ways, in a silent moment of calm when the storm inside of us finally subsides, in a word from an unexpected source, and in strength that comes back to us when we thought we had none left. The cycle of sin and salvation is more than just history. It is the tale of every heart that wanders and is rescued by mercy. Imagine this pattern developing in the land of Israel. A period of calm would descend upon the villages, with laughter resonating, kids playing fearlessly in the fields, marketplaces bustling with activity, and families congregating in safety. The people would rest for years, thankful for God's deliverance. But gradually, complacency was fostered by familiarity. Gratitude gave way to entitlement, and people's eyes strayed to their neighbors' altars. As the drums and chants of idol worship became louder, the worship at Yahweh's altar became quieter. Softly and silently, the cycle restarted until its weight came back. The people also learned the same lesson each time they were subjected to oppression. Their strength was insufficient. They couldn't be saved by any alliance. cunning plan, or strong will. Turning around and focusing on the God who never abandoned them, even when they were separated from Him, was the first step toward their hope. And each time, God's compassion was greater than their failure, and His mercy was fresh. The land would find peace again when He raised up another deliverer, another voice, and another arm to save them. Almost like breathing in and out, this rhythm resembles the waves coming ashore and then retreating. It is dependable, steady, and incredibly human. Who among us hasn't experienced what it's like to falter, make mistakes again, and fall into a pattern of failure? And who among us hasn't experienced the joy of being raised up when we couldn't stand on our own, or the relief of grace? Perhaps this cycle's beauty lies in what it reveals about God's character as well as in the story of Israel. He can tolerate hearing the same cry over and over again. Even after His people have failed 1,000 times, He is still merciful enough to deliver. He is dependable enough to return wave after wave, meeting His people where they are weak and providing strength. Imagine a man watching the last of the light disappear from the hills while he sits outside his house at dusk. His heart aches because he is aware of his people's suffering, their wandering, and the fact that they have no hope. On their own. God of our fathers, help us, he murmurs, raising his gaze to the sky. It is a silent prayer that is nearly insignificant. Nevertheless, that murmur becomes part of a nationwide chorus of voices as a nation rediscovers the God they had forgotten. Though it doesn't always happen right away, the solution eventually appears. Another season of peace begins, another deliverance takes place, and another judge rises. This never-ending cycle occurs not because God enjoys repeating it, but rather because His people frequently forget things. However, because His mercy is limitless, the cycle is also limitless. He responded each time they screamed. He greeted them each time they turned around. He raised them up each time they fell. Therefore, the story of the judges is a tale of both divine patience and human frailty. It is about the faithfulness of a God who does not desert His people, not just about failure. The tide of mercy always comes back, even though the waves of sign may rise. Even though the cycle seems never-ending, His compassion does. You might even be able to identify your own position within this rhythm tonight as you allow these words to become ingrained in your heart. You might be living in a time of peace or a time of conflict. Maybe you're calling out, or maybe you're waiting to be saved. The story serves as a reminder that mercy is close at hand, that the same God who answered Israel still answers today, and that no failure cycle is too great for the waves of His grace to break. After a long, dry silence, the story of the first judge starts off softly, almost like a gentle wind sweeping across the landscape. Despite being remembered by history as the first deliverer of Israel, Othniel was just a man living among his people at the time, with the same doubts and anxieties as everyone else. He didn't grow up hearing whispers about his fate or hearing songs about his greatness. Othniel himself was no superhero, but he was the nephew of Caleb, the loyal spy who had once defied the tide of unbelief. In the quiet moments of his life, his faith was being molded for a moment far bigger than he could have ever imagined. He was a man of flesh and blood, of uncertainties and minor decisions. By that time, Israel was a restless land. They had once experienced the joy of promises being kept and the sweetness of victory as they entered the bay. inheritance that God had bestowed upon them. However, their adversaries gradually closed in as their hearts swayed. Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram-Naharaim, arrived from the east, and his armies terrorized Israel's villages. The oppression now caused the people who once sang of freedom to groan. They lived in this shadow for 8 long years, their songs replaced by cries, their courage broken, their strength sapped. The people recalled the God they had forgotten during this difficult time. They raised their prayers in trembling voices, revealing their need and weakness like frail offerings. And the compassionate God responded. His mercy stirred as he gazed upon his tired people. Othniel, the quiet man with a firm faith and a heart still in line with his father's God, was raised. By him from among them. Othniel didn't stand up on his own 2 feet or raise his voice proclaiming his greatness. He was changed at that very moment when the Spirit of the Lord descended upon him. Picture Othniel the night before combat. He might have been sitting close to a small fire and observing the flames as they flickered against the night. He felt the pressure of what was ahead. Fear was nothing new to him. No man is. He probably questioned whether he was brave enough to face the enemy, whether he was enough, and whether the people would follow him. But he leaned into something bigger than himself in the silence. He recalled the God of Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. He recalled the tales of the fall of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, and the collapse of the walls of Jericho. He was also aware that the same God who had performed these actions was still present among his people. Othniel spearheaded the attack on Cushan-Rishathaim in the morning. He won the battle because the Lord's Spirit clothed him, not because he was smart or strong. A force greater than himself drove every step he took, every sword swing he made, and every cry of bravery. Israel breathed free once more after the oppressor was vanquished. The land let out a sigh of relief after years of bondage. And the people lived in peace for 40 years, a whole generation. It is easy to think of Othniel as perfect, as if he never had any difficulties or battled doubt. To see the beauty of his story, however, is to humanize him. He was picked because he trusted God in his fear, not because he was fearless. He was elevated not because he was powerful in and of himself, but rather because he was open to being used by the powerful one. He was courageous not because he did not tremble, but because he chose to go forward in spite of his weakness, trusting that God's promise was stronger. Maybe that's why, despite the passing of centuries, his story still resonates with us. How often have we sat in our own shadows, carrying weights that felt excessively heavy and harboring doubts in the back of our minds? How many times have we questioned whether we were strong enough to handle the challenges that awaited us? However, as Othniel learned, our strength comes from the God who hears our prayers, not from ourselves. Peace was briefly restored by Othniel's victory. Yes, the land rested, but people tend to forget. The memory of oppression faded as the years of silence went by, and the populace once more veered toward compromise. His tale serves as a reminder that when hearts are not unwavering, even the greatest deliverance is only momentary. After Othniel's voice was removed, the people were still drawn to idols despite the peace his leadership had brought. However, there is a lesson to be learned even from this. The ultimate solution was never intended to be Othniel's deliverance. His story, along with the stories of all subsequent judges, indicated a greater need, a deliverer who would free hearts for all time, not just break chains for a generation. Othniel was the first of many flawed heroes who came to people's aid but failed to change their hearts. His victory was sincere, his courage admirable, and his faith real, but his peace was fleeting. Nevertheless, it was significant because it demonstrated God's mercy, which never forsook his people. At that particular point in time, Othniel probably faded back into the routines of everyday life as the fires subsided and people went back to living their lives. Maybe he sat with his family and told stories to kids who had never experienced the terror of Cusan-Rishathaim's rule. Maybe he heard laughter where there had been tears when he strolled through the fields at sunset. He understood that peace was a gift in and of itself, delicate yet lovely, and that he had been permitted to share in it. Othniel's story is one of quiet faith transformed into something extraordinary by the work of God's Spirit. It serves as a reminder that those who quietly trust are frequently the ones who are saved, not the loudest shouters. His 40 years of peace served as a period of rest in the middle of the cycle, a long exhale for the country. However, beneath that tranquility, the human heart continued to struggle, wander, and yearn for more. Even though Othniel's tenure as judge was coming to an end, the God who had raised him was still there, prepared to act when his people cried out again. As a result, his name appears at the start of the book of Judges, not as the greatest or most dramatic, but as the first, the man who demonstrated what God could accomplish with a single life given up. His legacy stems from his readiness to follow the guidance of God's Spirit, not from his own prowess. And a whole country found peace, if only temporarily, in that silent surrender. As if whispered in hidden passageways where shadows loom, and silence is more powerful than words. The story of Ehud opens in silence. Israel had once more forgotten their God, and chains were always the result of forgetting. The Moabites, who were ruled by King Eglon, were the oppressor this time, and they came from the east. His influence in Israel was profound, both in terms of strength and character. Eglon was known for his bulk, extravagance, and ravenousness, which reflected the avarice with which he forced Israel to submit. The people of God bowed under his hand for 18 long years, receiving tribute and gifts year after year that served as a reminder of servitude rather than generosity. Every coin served as a reminder of their decline, and every offering was a wound to their dignity. The people screamed in the face of this oppression, and God once more responded kindly. This time, a member of the Benjamin tribe by the name of Ehud delivered him. One particular fact, that Ehud was left-handed, makes his story unique, even though it may seem trivial and unimportant. The right hand was regarded as strong, dominant, and preferred in that culture. The left was frequently ignored, undervalued, and even perceived as weak. However, God would use what others would reject as the very tool that would save them. Picture Ehud moving silently and perceptively among his people. Due to his left-handedness, he carried his weapon in a unique way, strapping it to his right thigh, out of sight, rather than the left hip as everyone had assumed. He would gain an advantage from this small detail, this unnoticed distinction. The fact that God can transform what the world perceives as weakness into strength, and that the unexpected and unusual can serve as the very mechanism for restoring. Freedom is a beautiful truth. Ehud was one of those selected to deliver the tribute to King Eglon when it was time for Israel to do so. The trip itself would have felt heavy, with humiliation weighing down each step and serving as a constant reminder of Israel's enslavement. Nevertheless, there was a silent fire burning in Ehud's heart. He was carrying a secret, a plan that had been developed in silence rather than haste, and he was more than just delivering money. His mission was cloaked in silence, as if it were a secret narrative taking place behind the powerful's back. The scene would have been formidable, standing in front of King Eglon. With his bulky frame and ravenous appetite, the king's presence was lavish, and his haughtiness permeated the room like the dense summer heat. The attendants watched as the tribute was offered. This moment appeared to be typical, just another year of humiliation and a reminder of being a prisoner. However, Ehud, composed and methodical, was carrying something invisible, a sharp, double-edged dagger concealed under his clothes, resting on his right thigh where no guard would dare to look. Ehud dismissed the other men who had accompanied him as the tribute was offered and the task appeared to be finished. "I have a secret message for you, O king," he said carefully and softly as he turned back toward Eglon alone. The king was intrigued by the whispered words. Secrets like these always pique people's interest because power is insatiably thirsty for new information, advantages, and unspoken facts. Unaware that the secret he invited would spell the end of his reign, Eglon threw aside his attendants and leaned forward expectantly. The king's slow breaths and Ehud's steady heartbeat were the only sounds in the room now. Ehud took a step closer and said, "I have a message from God for you." His left hand suddenly reached for the concealed dagger and quickly and precisely removed it from its position. The king's flesh was deeply penetrated by the blade. Scripture vividly describes Eglon's enormous size and how the fat covered the blade to prevent Ehud from pulling it out. The last moan of a man who had persecuted God's people for too long was the only sound to break the room's silence. With cool shrewdness, Ehud locked the doors behind him and walked out of the room. The doors were locked when the king's servants returned, leading them to believe he was sleeping or possibly urinating. Their hesitancy gave Ehud valuable time, allowing him to evade the watch, navigate the city, and disappear into the safety of the hills. The deliverer was gone by the time the truth was revealed, and Israel was already feeling the vajinda reverberation of his action. Ehud was not the silent man bringing tribute when he returned to his people. He arrived in the hill country of Ephraim as the fearless voice of freedom, calling for Israel to rise by blowing the trumpet. After the Moabites were confused, Israel won a resounding victory and defeated 10,000 of their adversaries in the ensuing battle. The land began to breathe once more after the yoke of Moab was broken. There was peace for 80 years to complete generations rather than just a year or two. Israel knew rest in the shadow of Ehud's bravery, however, despite being whispered. The story has multiple levels of meaning. It was no coincidence that Ehud was left-handed. It was the very thing that made him appear unexpected, the very thing that men and guards ignored. It seems as though God takes great pleasure in using the obscure and ignored as the basis for his deliverance. The silent blade served as more than just a weapon. It served as a reminder that God's ways are not always loud, clear-cut, or conventional. His salvation can occasionally arrive subtly, like a whispered secret or a dagger that is hidden until it is revealed. Ehud's story also has a profoundly human element. He wasn't a warrior with songs about his prowess or a giant like Samson would be. He was a man with a silent impact, a subtle power that only gained strength in God's hands. His bravery lay not in his strength, but in his willingness to take a chance, take action, and have faith that God's message would win out. The ensuing peace must have seemed miraculous to Israel, a relief that lasted for decades and gave them enough time to have children, grow up, and get married without ever realizing the oppressive hand of Moab. However, this peace was brittle, reliant on a people's memory as well as the deliverance of a single man, just like all the stories in Judges. Additionally, Israel's memory frequently deteriorated over time. What was once cherished as God's kindness could quickly be forgotten and replaced by complacency and the ancient trend toward idolatry. Nevertheless, the tale of Ehud lingers in the center of the Bible like a gentle reminder of how God operates. He uses what others miss, he whispers deliverance in unexpected ways, and he brings peace in ways that the world cannot foresee. A picture of a just and merciful God who hears the cries of his people and responds in ways that perplex the arrogant is painted by the silent blade, the left-handed strike, and the locked chamber. The story raises a question for us. How frequently do we disregard things that appear minor, feeble, or out of the ordinary? And how frequently does God give those very things his power? The quiet times in our lives, the little things we don't notice, the hidden strengths, these can be the tools of liberation, the places where his Spirit works most deeply. Therefore, Ehud's name is remembered not only as a judge, but also as a deliverer who transformed silence into freedom, weakness into strength, and secrecy into victory. For generations, his bold and covert deed altered the destiny of his people. For a while, the land experienced rest, and the people recalled the God who had not forgotten them. Even though peace would not last forever. In the Bible, the story of Shamgar is only one verse long, tucked away almost inconspicuously between the longer stories of Ehud and Deborah. Some may consider it a footnote, a mere remark, hardly enough to build a story around. Shamgar's name is brief, powerful, and a reminder that God's deliverance isn't always encased in lengthy speeches or dramatic details. However, sometimes the smallest brushstrokes in a painting carry the greatest contrast. Just one sentence, but it contains courage, faith, and a silent miracle. After him was Shamgar son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he too saved Israel. That is all Judges tells us. Consider the scene. Israel's peace was brittle and short-lived, and they were tired again. They were under intense pressure from the Philistines, who dominated fields and roads and suffocated villages with their power. Freedom would have seemed like an unattainable dream. They were shepherds, farmers, and peasants without many armies or weapons. In contrast, the Philistines were well-trained, armed, and unrelenting. It was unthinkable to oppose them with equal vigor. Shamgar, however, enters this scene of oppression, not a king, a general, or even a man brandishing a sword, but a person brandishing an ox goad, a farmer's implement used for herding cattle rather than fighting. Simple ox goad was a long wooden staff that was sometimes equipped with a flat blade on one end to scrape mud from plows, and frequently tipped with a sharpened point on the other end to prod animals forward. No one would imagine it in the hands of a warrior. It was neither glitzy nor majestic, but Shamgar had this. He was only given what he already had. He was not given iron chariots or armies behind him. And God used that little, inconspicuous instrument to deliver his people. Imagine Shamgar in the fields as the Philistines approach, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight, their voices confident and loud. He stands by himself with the determination of a bravely stirred heart rather than the power of an army. He holds the ox goad, which is smooth from daily use. The scene must have appeared ridiculous to anyone observing one man against hundreds, wood against iron, a farmer against soldiers. However, courage frequently appears as foolishness before its strength is revealed. Shamgar raises what little he has with calm resolve and steady breathing, and in God's strength, it becomes sufficient. According to the verse, he defeated 600 Philistines. It's a startling, nearly overwhelming number. How could one man use such a tool to achieve such a feat? There are no specifics provided, but maybe that's the idea. The God who stood with Shamgar was the source of his power, not his weapon or even his arm. The fact that it occurred is more important than the specifics of how it occurred. The overlooked tool became a weapon of deliverance, the weak became strong, and the impossible became possible. When we consider our own lives, this story has a deeply calming effect. We are frequently tempted to think that in order to have an impact we need to possess something exceptional. We think that change necessitates extraordinary skill, enormous resources, or great power. However, Shamgar reminds us that when the most basic tools are in the hands of someone who is prepared to act with faith, the biggest changes can occasionally result. Our lives are full of ox goads, small skills, quiet opportunities, and common gifts that God can use to accomplish extraordinary things. The ox goad was not special until it was lifted in courage. Consider the kind analogy. The ox goad was designed to lead and transport animals. When it was in Shamgar's hands, it changed not only cattle, but also a people's fate, even though it was not designed to hurt or fight. In the same way, when God infuses them with His purpose, the things we consider to be commonplace, our words, our generosity, our perseverance, even the everyday chores of family and work can become tools of change. When motivated by faith, even seemingly inconsequential things can have the power to save lives. Shamgar's willingness, not his weapon, was what showed his courage. Given the odds, he could have concluded that there was no chance. He might have remained silent out of fear, waiting for someone more capable or powerful to take action. But he made the decision to move forward, to lift what was already in his grasp, and to have faith that God would make use of it. Even though it is only expressed in a single verse, that choice has historical resonance. It tells us that one person, one brave deed, or one basic tool can be the turning point toward freedom. The simplicity of Shamgar's tale is what makes it so calming. It is not overflowing with lengthy speeches or intricate plans. It has nothing to do with a large army or a convoluted strategy. It's just about a man, a tool, and a God who provides. Knowing that God doesn't ask for things we don't have brings us peace. He doesn't wait until we have a lot of resources or strong hands. If we just put it in His hands, He can work with what we already have. Shamgar's strength and the strangeness of it must have astounded the Philistines who fell before him. A farmer wielding a stick undoes war-trained soldiers. Their downfall teaches us that even the most basic act of faith can cause pride and strength to crumble. The silent determination of a person standing with God is far more powerful than the timbai Iron-laden, destructively sharpened weapons of this world. And peace came back to Israel. Although it is unclear how long or how much of an impact Shamgar's deed had on the land, it is obvious that he saved Israel. Even though his name is short, it is forever recorded not as a forgotten anecdote, but as a reminder that God uses every available vessel. His story's soft cadence prompts us to stop and consider what ox goad we are holding. What unnoticed resource, quiet talent, or tiny gift has God already put in our lives that He might be just waiting to use? We don't have to wait for swords and chariots. Sometimes God uses what we consider commonplace for His extraordinary purposes. In this sense, Shamgar's tale is about being freed from the notion that we are too insignificant to matter, in addition to being freed from the Philistines. His verse-length story dispels the myth that grandeur is necessary for change. It reveals, to us, quietly, like a whisper through the ages, that faith can turn the ordinary into the extraordinary, and that faith in God's power can make even a farmer's tool more powerful than an army's arsenal. In the shade of a palm tree, the story opens. Quietly, the branches sway softly in the breeze, the air is still, and a woman who is unlike anyone else in Israel is sitting there. Deborah is her name. Although she does not lead an army or carry a sword, her wisdom is like cool water in a dry land. People seek her advice, discernment, and judgment from all over Israel. They bring disagreements, inquiries, and troubles, and they discover in her not only understanding but also empathy. As a prophetess, judge, and mother to Israel, Deborah exemplifies gentle strength, modest leadership, and authority based on grace rather than force. There was a lot of oppression. At the time, the cycle of forgetting their God, turning to idols, and then moaning under the burden of foreign rule had once again befallen Israel. Jabin, the king of Canaan, and his commander Sisera, whose iron chariots terrified the villages, were the oppressors. This time, the people suffered for 20 years, their cries ascending to heaven like smoke. In this context, Deborah emerged. She arrived with wisdom rather than armies or revolutions. The people saw in her something uncommon, a leader who embodied both justice and compassion, firmness and tenderness, as she sat beneath her palm tree, her seat of judgment. Her palm tree was a peaceful location that anyone could visit, situated between Bethel and Ramah. That picture is strong in and of itself. Deborah sat outside, under the sky, beneath a tree that was deeply ingrained in the soil of the land that God had given His people, in contrast to generals who hid behind walls or rulers who confined themselves to palaces. From the poorest peasant to the wealthiest elder, anyone could come to her and be heard. She listened with the heart of a mother bearing her children's burdens, not with impatience or pride. Deborah's leadership stands out for its uniqueness. Her leadership was characterized by vision, prayer, and wisdom during a period when strength of arm or swordsmanship were frequently used to evaluate leaders. She serves as a reminder that genuine strength is not always obvious or overt. It can occasionally be found in discernment, gentleness, and the capacity to see clearly when others are obscured by mist. Her tale resonates with women today who lead by exhibiting grace, compassion, and inner resolve rather than by copying harshness. Deborah was a prophetess in addition to being a judge. The people heard God's instructions in her voice as He spoke through her. She sent for a man named Barak one day under that same palm tree. Strong and capable, he was a reluctant warrior. She conveyed the word of the Lord to him, "Assemble 10,000 men from Zebulun and Naphtali, and proceed to Mount Tabor, for God will bring Sisera to them." Although the instruction was straightforward and the promise was unambiguous, Barak's heart shook. In response, he said he would only go if Deborah accompanied him. His hesitancy has a tender human quality to it. Barak stumbled when he saw Sisera's iron chariots. However, he saw in Deborah a strength that anchored him, a bravery that summoned his own, and a presence that steadied him. Without her by his side, he wouldn't go. Deborah agreed with a quiet determination, but not before letting him know that a woman would receive the honor of the victory instead of him. The narrative twists in a way that seems almost poetic at this point. Deborah, who was already a unique leader in her era, proclaims that women's bravery, not a warrior's sword, will bring about deliverance. Something that goes beyond human expectations and challenges the arrogance of armies and the presumptions of power as being set in motion. When the time came, Barak led the Israelite army to Mount Tabor. The sight of Sisera's iron chariots filling the horizon, like a storm, must have created a tense atmosphere. Deborah's voice, however, cut through the anxiety. Reminding Barak that the Lord had already gone before them, she called out to him to take action. That moment is remarkable because Deborah's faith kept them moving forward when hesitation might have paralyzed them. The Lord confused Sisera's forces, the army descended, and the seemingly impossible became possible. Even though the drama of the battle extends beyond the palm tree, Deborah, leading not by force but by vision, is where it all starts. Her strength came from her faith in God's word, not from weapons. Her leadership inspired Barak and provided guidance to Israel, demonstrating that sometimes the most potent act of deliverance starts with someone who is prepared to listen, speak the truth, and maintain their faith. Deborah's story is further complicated by her later self-description of herself as a mother in Israel. She was not aloof or uncaring in her leadership. It was born out of love and duty and was very personal. She viewed her people as children in need of direction, safety, and hope rather than as subjects. Our perception of leadership is altered by that maternal image. Nurturing, protecting, making sacrifices, and encouraging the best in people even when they doubt themselves are all parts of being a motherly leader. She demonstrates how love-based authority can outweigh fear-based authority. Deborah's example is incredibly relatable to readers and listeners today. How many women today are in positions of leadership in their families, communities, or even countries, exhibiting that same combination of compassion and wisdom? How many people take on roles requiring strength, but decide to use it gracefully rather than harshly? Deborah serves as a reminder that genuine leadership is about accepting and faithfully using the gifts that God has given us, not about conforming to someone else's model of power. The palm tree turns into a symbol, almost a personality unto itself. It is rooted, stable, and reaches upward while offering shade below. While Deborah listened, judged, and led beneath it, it stands tall and endures the seasons. Maybe her being beneath that tree reflects its attributes, steady in storms, rooted in reality, providing refuge to those in need. People gathered around her wisdom, just as they did under its branches. There is more to Deborah's story beneath the palm tree than just history. It is an invitation to adopt a new perspective on leadership, to value voices that are frequently disregarded, and to acknowledge that God raises up deliverers in ways that go against what is expected of them. Deborah serves as a reminder that faith can calm shaky hearts, that wisdom is as strong as might, and that the hand of God frequently passes through those who lead with love. She embodies these lessons through her calm strength, motherly heart, and prophetic voice. The battle was over. The dust had settled, and the valleys where the earth had once been shook by the roar of chariots were now silent. Israel was amazed, not only by their triumph, but also by how it had happened. Once emblems of unstoppable power, Sisera's magnificent chariots were now shattered and dispersed. His name had already faded like mist in the morning sun, and his soldiers had run away. And a song started to emerge in that silence, as if the land itself had held its breath and then released it. The prophetess Deborah's voice, raised like a lullaby for a tired people, sang it instead of the clang of swords or the stomp of armies. The song of Deborah was more than just a triumphant hymn. It was a song that soothed and taught at night, a reminder that was carried in rhythm, and a memory woven in melody. With a gentle yet firm voice, she sang, "Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, and sing a song." The repetition itself was melodic, resembling the gentle waves lapping the shoreline, coming and going repeatedly. She sang for those who had screamed out against oppression and had been heard, not for herself. She reminded them that the God who had defended them was the same God who had always been by their side as she recounted the tale from hopelessness to deliverance. She started off by praising. Praise the Lord when Israel's princes take the initiative and when the populace voluntarily offers themselves. Her song honored those who had chosen to stand up, come forward, and re-establish their faith in God. In addition to the leaders, she seemed to be encircling the country like children and singing them into memory to break the cycle of forgetting. If only temporarily, her song's rhythm created images. She described how the mountains shook, the earth shook, and the heavens poured when the Lord was present. Nature itself has joined the battle, she said. It was the Creator's hand, not chance, that caused the storm to surge against Sisera's iron chariots. Rain caused the battlefield to turn to mud, and once unstoppable chariots became stuck, sinking, and useless. It appeared as though the sky had leaned low to scatter their oppressors, and the earth itself had risen to defend God's people. Her remarks lingered in the mind of Jael, the woman who struck Sisera with the decisive blow with silent bravery. Jael was praised in her song for her unexpected bravery that changed the course of history, not for her cruelty. Deborah's voice did not glorify violence. Rather, it elevated the story into poetry, turning the terrifying event into something reverently remembered and woven into the identity of a people who had been saved. Her praise was repeated softly, like a refrain intended to linger in the heart. Most blessed of women be Jael. Most blessed be she. Her lullaby-like song also conveyed contrasts, the sound of celebration in Israel's tents, a queen gazing in vain from her window, and mothers waiting for sons who would never return. She reminded her audience that deliverance was not light without shadow, but rather a blending of both by painting joy and sorrow side by side. Sisera's mother wondered why her son's chariot was delayed as she looked through the lattice. Surely they are dividing the spoil. Surely they are choosing garments. Surely they are finding treasures, the maidens around her reassured her with. But Deborah's song turns this into a silent irony. The mother waited, but her son never showed. Oopie. The song doesn't make fun of her. Rather, it lingers as a reminder of the weight of loss and the frailty of power. Like a sigh, the song kept returning to its core. Israel had been defended by the Lord Himself. Deborah's song served as more than just a celebration. It was a catechism, reminding the people that divine mercy, not human intervention, was the reason for their deliverance. She encircled their weary hearts with the truth in her repetition. You cried out, and God heard. You were oppressed, and God delivered. You were lost, and God found you again. The song has a steady, slow rhythm that resembles travel footsteps. Like rocking a child to sleep, its repetition calms, almost hypnotizing. She sang to herself and everyone else who listened, "March on, my soul, be strong." It is both a call and a reassurance, a command and an encouragement. Like breathing or the steady pulse of life, the words rise and fall. They contain strength and rest. Deborah went on to sing about tribes that had stayed behind and tribes that had come to fight. Her words, which evoked both courage and hesitation, were firm but gentle. She listed those who put their lives in danger on the battlefield and those who supported one another during the storm. She did, however, also mention those who stayed among the sheepfolds and lingered by their ships. To remind, not to embarrass. Because truth must be sung in order to be remembered, and songs preserve truth. Her song ended peacefully, as all lullabies do. O Lord, may all of your enemies die. Her last words were like a soft light spilling over the hills at dawn, promising warmth after long cold nights. But may those who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. The people were lulled into hope, rest, and remembrance by her cadence. In addition to poetry, that final line contained prophecy. Love for God is unstoppable, steady, and renewing like the rising sun. Memory was woven into melody in the Song of Deborah, which was more than just a hymn to victory. It was the mother of Israel telling her children the faithfulness of their God while she sang them to sleep. It was melody that preserved truth, repetition that taught, and rhythm that cured. The song would endure long after the battle was forgotten, because every verse, picture, and refrain served as a stone anchored in the core of their identity. The song under the palm tree and in the Israelite hills is what remains most resonant even today when the story is recounted, not the battle of the armies. A song that has been sung repeatedly over the ages serves as a constant reminder to everyone listening. God is dependable. God provides, and God's people are never completely forgotten. A man by the name of Gideon stood threshing wheat in a winepress. In the quiet of the night, with the stars strewn across the velvet sky like diamonds, out of sight of the Midianites who had tormented Israel for 7 long years. He was not a leader, a warrior, or someone the populace would look up to. He was a farmer, a son, and a regular guy who was burdened by fear. With too many camels to count, the Midianites arrived like locust swarms, suffocating everyone with their presence. They left Israel shaking, ate the harvests, and bared the land. Gideon secretly whispered his work in this darkness, his heart pounding with each sound, and an angel of the Lord showed up in this strange location, amidst dust and concealed grain. The words were as calm as a night breeze, but they were shocking. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon was shocked and almost unsure of what he had heard, and he looked around as if the greeting could not have been addressed to him. The angel remarked, "Mighty warrior," but Gideon's heart was filled with uncertainty. He was frightened, small in his own eyes, and overcome with hopelessness. He was not a warrior. Instead of responding with assurance, he asked the kind of questions that arise from tired souls. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are the wonders that our forefathers told us about? His voice faltered, reiterating the queries that all hearts harbor during painful and silent moments. The angel did not correct Gideon for his fear or dispute his doubts. Rather, the words were firm but gentle. Go with all your strength. Am I not sending you? Insecurity influenced Gideon's response. How can I save Israel? His words reveal a man who sees his shortcomings more clearly than his potential, a man whose eyes are fixed on his limitations rather than the one who calls him. My clan is the weakest, and I am the least in my family. Nevertheless, the assurance remained constant. I will be with you. It was about the presence of the God who never abandons, not Gideon's strength. Gideon wrestled nonetheless. He yearned for reassurance, for a signal to stop the shaking within him. He then prepared a bread and meat offering and presented it to the messenger. The food caught fire as soon as the angel touched it with a staff, quickly devouring it. When Gideon realized he had seen the Lord's messenger, his fear turned into awe and his doubt into trembling. But even here, God welcomed him with calm, saying, "Don't be scared. You will not perish." Gideon constructed an altar and called it, "The Lord is Peace." It was a reassuring whisper, a haven of calm in a sea of doubt. However, the call didn't stop there. Gideon was instructed to demolish his father's altar to Baal and chop down the Asherah pole that stood next to it. This was no small mandate. It was to confront the very practices that had brought oppression and the idols that had enticed Israel away. Fearful of the villagers, Gideon obeyed, but only at night. His obedience was genuine, but it was veiled in terror. He was a reluctant hero, his feet shaking as he stepped forward. Gideon's father wisely said, "If Baal really is a god, let him defend himself." From that day on, Gideon went by the name Jerubbaal, which means, "Let Baal contend." The townspeople were furious when they woke up and realized what had been done. Nevertheless, Gideon's heart continued to crave assurance as his journey went on. The Lord's Spirit descended upon Gideon, giving him the courage to call forth the tribes as the Midianites gathered in the valley in overwhelming numbers. As the armies assembled, Gideon turned back to heaven and prayed for another sign. He presented the fleece to the Lord, first requesting that dew only fall on it while the ground stayed dry, and then the following night, asking for dew to fall only on the ground while the fleece remained dry. He prayed in a hesitant voice, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request." These were not the words of a fearless commander, but rather of a frail man who longed to know that he was not mistaken and that God was really on his side. God patiently responded, giving Gideon the signs he so desperately sought, not a rebuke, but a reassurance. Every heart that has ever questioned itself, every soul that has ever muttered, "Am I enough?" can find a mirror in Gideon's tale. His hesitancy and fear were not unusual. We also examine our shortcomings, fears, and mistakes, and question how anything great could have come from us. We also look for indications, assurances, and evidence that we are not alone in our journey. Gideon's story is less about victory and more about grace because of his genuine and unvarnished humanity. Gideon was chosen by God, not because he was strong, but rather because he was willing to follow instructions, despite his fear. It is consoling to know that Gideon's cautious steps were nevertheless positive ones. His questions did not silence his calling, nor did his doubt disqualify him. The same God who was patient with Gideon's fear is also gentle with us. In Gideon's story, faith develops gradually, like dawn after a long night, rather than being perfect. It teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the ability to move forward in spite of it, while clinging to the silent knowledge that we are not walking alone. Gideon had no idea how God would use him or how the days ahead would play out as he stood at the valley's edge, his heart still shaking. But whether we are facing the silent battles within our own hearts or standing in front of the great armies of Midian, he carried the promise made at the beginning, whispered repeatedly in various ways, "I will be with you." Perhaps that is the only guarantee any of us really need. Thus, Gideon's story starts out with hesitation and murmurs rather than with grandeur or boldness. It starts with a man who had self-doubt but was accepted by the God who sees beyond our frailties. He was just a man standing with a fleece in the stillness of the night, waiting, hoping, and gradually coming to trust. It was the start of a journey that would mold him into the judge who would guide Israel to victory. With its tents dispersed across the plain like shadows upon shadows, the night drew a velvet curtain over the valley of Jezreel, where innumerable Midianites slept. Soldiers were scattered as far as the eye could follow, and camels were huddled in uncountable numbers. When the Israelites saw them from the hills, it was a picture of impossibility, a sight that would make their knees weak and their chest tight. But in this vastness, Gideon stood with his small group of men, 300, not thousands, not even hundreds upon hundreds gathered around him. Their numbers are ridiculously small, 300 against thousands. However, this was precisely how God intended it to be, so that he alone would be the one to win, not men. The tale of how they got to be 300 was already an odd one. Initially, Gideon had called forth a large group of people. In response, the tribes sent men with weapons, hope, and trembling hearts who were prepared to fight. However, God muttered that there were too many of them. Israel would claim the victory as their own strength if they won with such a large number. A smaller army remained after thousands of people left after Gideon was ordered to send home the terrified. Once more, God declared it to be too many, and the final choice was made by simply drinking water from the stream. There were only 300 left, the ones who lapped the water with their hands, alert and prepared. 300 against a multitude. It was a thinning of pride rather than strength, so that Israel's hearts would learn to rely on God rather than their own strength. Gideon was still shaken by fear as the camp fell silent. Knowing how much he was shaking, the Lord asked him to sneak over to the edge of the Midianite camp and listen. Thus, the night air was cool and the ground was soft as Gideon and his servant slipped down in the shadows. As they approached the tents, Gideon heard a soldier talking to another and heard voices murmuring in the darkness. The man said, "I had a dream." A round barley bread loaf tumbled into the Midianite camp. His companion retorted, "This can only be the sword of Gideon son of Joash, because it struck a tent so violently that it overturned and collapsed." The Midianites and the entire camp are under God's control, like a dawn breaking in Gideon's soul. The words fell upon him. Trembling transformed into silent strength, and fear gave way to awe. Right there in the middle of the night, he bowed in worship before finally returning to his men with his steady heart. Once uncertain, his voice now carried assurance. Arise! The Midianite camp has been entrusted to you by the Lord. His plan was as bizarre and surreal as the night vision itself. Instead of a sword, each man would carry a trumpet, and instead of a shield, a torch hidden inside a clay jar. Silently, 3 companies of 100 each circled the camp. Only the breath of men pressed to trumpets and the brittle glow of hidden light. No great weapons, no chariots, no powerful machines of war. The battle itself seemed to be a story told by the wind, a vision dot when midnight arrived. The camp was at its most slumbering, and the guards were changing. Silence, the kind that hums in the ears, weighed down the valley. Then, like 1,000 stars exploding into brightness, the sound of clay breaking sounded, a wave of jars breaking all at once. In the night, torches blazed, exposing faces that shone in the firelight as the flames danced. The blaring of trumpets sliced through the valley like thunder, their sound piercing and sharp. Like a chorus from the heavens, the cry arose from 300 voices, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Chaos broke out in the Midianite camp. Awakened from their slumber, the soldiers staggered in bewilderment as they were surrounded by fire and noise and blinded by torches. Panic spread like wildfire. They swung their swords at one another in the darkness, unable to tell friend from enemy. Cries filled the night, tents collapsed, camels dispersed, and the great host vanished in fear. Before 300 people, who never even raised their blades, what had started out as a force too great to count now vanished in terror dot as witnesses to God's hand. Gideon and his men stood. With their breath visible in the cool night air, they held torches that continued to flicker and trumpets that continued to reverberate across the hills. As the crowd fled, they saw strength crumble, not because of their own might, but because of the invisible hand that transformed confusion into salvation and dreams into reality. Once resonating with the hum of Midian's might, the valley now shook as they withdrew. This moment's strangeness and dreamlike quality are what make it so beautiful. Jars, torches, and sound were used in this battle instead of weapons. Every little detail seems to speak softly, as if God painted the night with symbols. Light concealed in delicate jars shines brightest when broken. Sound released in unison travels farther than strength. Weakness relinquished becomes the platform for divine power. A truth that reverberates well beyond the battlefield is hinted at by the victory of the 300. Deliverance frequently occurs not in the ways we anticipate, but rather in ways that humble, calm, and raise our gaze. The image still haunts you as today. We also carry clay jars, which appear to be weak and delicate, but inside them burns a light that God has placed there. Frequently, the light is at its brightest when the jar is broken through hardships or surrender. And like Gideon's men, we might feel insignificant in the face of the immensity of difficulties, the plethora of anxieties, and the armies of uncertainty. However, the narrative teaches that victory, strength, and peace are not brought about by numbers. The night is transformed into victory by God's presence, His invisible hand at work, and His strength woven through weakness. Gideon's 300 stood as dawn broke over the horizon, illuminating the sky with pale hues, not as victorious men bragging of their power, but as men in awe of what they had seen. Their voices were quieted after the shout, their torches flickered low, but a deep and peaceful assurance filled their hearts. Even in the darkest moments, when hope seems too small to matter, they were reminded that God is close by after witnessing the impossible undone and the countless scattered by the few. Thus, like a vision recalled after sleep, the story lies in the silence of that night that gave way to morning. The mystery of trust is more important than the conflict of armies. The flames, jars, and trumpets reverberate like cymbals in a dream, reminding us that even 300 in God's hands are sufficient to disperse the shadows of thousands. That strength arises from surrender, and that light shines through. Brokenness. Under Gideon's leadership, the land experienced peace in the quiet years that followed the victory of the 300. The people of Israel rested for a while after being freed from the Midianites. Once apprehensive and doubtful, Gideon developed into a man who led the tribes with courage and insight, but not as a king, because he himself turned down the throne when the populace demanded it. "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson," they had said, looking at him, because he had rescued them from Midian's clutches. However, Gideon's response was one of humility. "Neither my son nor I will rule over you." Israel's hearts were reminded that their real king was not a person with flesh and blood, but rather the one who had transformed their weakness into victory. "The Lord will rule over you." However, like a soft mist, peace is not always permanent. Though initially modest, Gideon's decisions in the years following the victory started to have an impact. In his city of Ophrah, he requested gold earrings from the war booty and used them to create an elaborate priestly garment known as an ephod. The people soon regarded it as a religious object, even though it might have started out as a token of appreciation or remembrance. They floated in its direction, bowing in ways that their hearts ought to have saved for God alone. The ephod turned into a trap for both Israel and Gideon's family. This subtle, nearly imperceptible change demonstrated how readily hearts gravitate toward outwardly visible symbols rather than the invisible faith that upholds. Because of his large household, which included wives and even a concubine in Shechem, Gideon lived a long life and had many sons. Even though he was blessed with many years, his life contained the seeds of future unrest. One of these sons, Abimelech, was born in Shechem, a city with its own goals and connections, rather than Ophrah, where his father's tribe lived. Abimelech's spirit was stirred not by peace but by a desire for power, and he grew restless for more. Abimelech yearned for kingship, not as a mantle of service, but as a crown of power, in contrast to Gideon's previous rejection. Israel's peace was shaky at the end of Gideon's life, tethered more to his memory than to their God's covenant. Abimelech moved forward into the quiet area created by Gideon's passing. He visited his mother's people in Shechem and convinced them that he was their kin. "Which is better for you, that all 70 of Jerubaal's sons rule over you, or that one man rule?" he asked in a whisper, a question that sparked ambition and loyalty. He was instilling in their hearts a desire for unity under his ruler. Kingship not bestowed by God, but acquired through scheming. So his words carried the weight of cunning. The promise of strength and familial ties drew the support of the people of Shechem. They gave him silver from the Baal-berith temple, and Abimelech used that money to assemble men who were heedless and morally bankrupt to follow him. Together, they did something that would tarnish Gideon's home's reputation. Abimelech slaughtered his brothers, 70 sons of Gideon, one by one on a single stone. because the ambition of one person destroyed the line of the man who once brought peace. The horror of it echoes through the narrative like a shadowed wind. The youngest, Jotham, managed to get away without anyone noticing. Later, Jotham's voice rose as a warning prophet rather than a soldier. He shouted a parable, a tale of trees looking for a king from Mount Gerizim, which looked down on Shechem. They requested that the vine, the fig tree, and the olive tree rule, but each of them declined, happy with their own role. Finally, they faced the thorn bush, which acquiesced with a threat, offering shade but threatening to burn if disgraced. The parable was obvious. Abimelech was the thorn bush, providing temporary cover but having the power to devour everything and cause devastation. Even though his words vanished into thin air, they served as a reminder that pride-driven power rarely leads to peace. Abimelech ruled Israel for 3 years in a precarious kingship based on treachery and bloodshed. He was initially backed by the city of Shechem, whose hopes were dependent on his strength. But gradually, uneasiness grew. Alliances changed, rumors spread, and God himself, unhappy with the carnage, sent a spirit of strife between Abimelech and the Shechem leaders. Ambushes were set, rebellion was sparked, and the city that had raised him turned against him. Abimelech sowed the seeds of violence, and they grew into thorns that pricked even his own hand, like waves that rise and fall. The narrative of Gideon's later years and Abimelech's ascent has a rhythm of contrast. In his heyday, Gideon was a man who pondered and questioned but relied on the word of God. His triumphs, which demonstrate that faith can move mountains even in trembling hands, were the result of surrender rather than strength. But as his life dragged on, little fissures appeared, the idolized Ehud, the numerous sons who split up his family, and the lack of a reliable mentor following his death. Abimelech entered that area of silent decline, seeking his own will rather than God's, and by exchanging his father's humility for the desire to become king, he brought Israel to grief. It is a subtle cautionary tale that is interwoven throughout the narrative. The presence of God, not armies or years, was what kept the peace during Gideon's time. Even the greatest triumphs became brittle when hearts strayed from that core. Instead of being loudly condemned, Abimelech's desire for power is conveyed with a soft melancholy, akin to a reminder in the night that ambition without faith swiftly devolves into disaster, and that leadership without humility becomes a trap. So, as was always the case back then, the cycle went on. The people would wander once more after Gideon and Abimelech, searching, stumbling, and yearning for direction while they awaited the arrival of the next deliverer. Bathed in blood and peace, the land of Canaan was a reflection of human hearts, restless in their wandering but yearning for rest. Jotham's parable reverberates throughout the narrative like a voice on the wind. That true kingship is found in the hand of the one who rules with justice, mercy, and peace, not in the thorn bush or in human grasping. The story of Jephthah emerges subtly from the periphery, where his journey was molded by rejection and adversity. Although he was Gilead's son, his mother was a prostitute rather than an honorable wife. As a result, Jephthah bore the sting of disdain from his birth. He was expelled by his half-brothers, who claimed he would not inherit anything from their father's home. He was driven away and took refuge in the land of Tob, where he assembled a group of men who were similar to him, outcasts and nomads. His leadership and strength grew in him like a tree pushing its roots deep into the dry soil. despite the fact that life had rejected him and that his place among his people had been denied. He was rough and scarred from rejection, but he had a resilience that was difficult to break. Gilead eventually encountered trouble. The Ammonites rebelled against Israel and pressed closely against its boundaries. The elders of Gilead looked for someone who could lead them into battle as fear swept through the villages. When none of them could, they thought of Jephthah, whom they had rejected. With cries of desperation, they approached him in Tob and begged him to come back and lead their armies. Jephthah's initial remarks were replete with resentment, reminding them of how they had disregarded him and deprived him of his dignity. "Why are you in distress and come to me now?" His voice was quiet, but it was heavy with years of suffering as he asked. However, the elders assured him that they would place him in charge of Gilead if he fought for them and won. Slowly, maybe. Reluctantly, Jephthah consented, and the very people who had once hated him chose him to lead after he was exiled. Jephthah tried peace before going to war. Inquiring as to why the king of Ammon had attacked Israel, he dispatched messengers. The king responded that the land was his people's, having been taken by Israel during their exodus from Egypt. Jephthah responded calmly and clearly, recounting the lengthy tale of Israel's journey and stating that the land had been taken from Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against Israel, rather than from Ammon. He reminded the Ammonite king that Israel had occupied the land for 300 years, and that up until now, no claim had been made. The king of Ammon ignored his steady, historically and rationally informed remarks. War became the only option after the road to peace closed. Then, in a whispered promise to the Lord, Jephthah made a vow. He spoke passionately but carelessly as the Spirit of God awoke within him, and he readied himself to charge into battle. His words hung in the air, binding him even though he had not yet realized the weight of what he had promised. "If you give the Ammonites into my hand, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it as a burnt offering." His vow might have seemed like devotion, a means of gaining God's favor, given the urgency of the situation and the shaky mixture of fear and hope. However, the haste of it would cause more grief than he could have ever envisioned. The actual fight came quickly. After gathering his troops, Jephthah moved to oppose the Ammonites. 20 towns from Aroer to the outskirts of Minnith were vanquished when the Lord gave them into his hands and struck them with tremendous force. The land was relieved once more when Israel's enemies were defeated. Families must have gathered in joy at the sight of their returning warriors, and songs of triumph may have risen. The promise he had made was very important to Jephthah, but he may have hoped it would go unnoticed. He hoped that a servant or an animal would appear when he saw his house. However, the doors of Jephthah's home opened when he got back to Mizpah, and his daughter emerged to greet him. She was dancing to timbrels, her face beaming with happiness at her father's triumph. She was his only child, his hope, his heart, and the person he loved most. The sound of fabric tearing in grief reverberated louder than any war cry as Jephthah ripped his garments at the sight of her. In the most agonizing way possible, his vow had come back to haunt him. He sobbed, "Oh, my daughter, you have depressed me greatly. You are one of the people who bother me." Because he knew what he had committed to, his words trembled with despair. "Because I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot go back." When his daughter heard the suffering, she did not react angrily or rebelliously. Rather, her heart was steady with acceptance, and her voice was calm. She said, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me according to what you have promised, since the Lord has granted you vengeance on your enemies." Despite the fact that her life would be cut short, she accepted the vow without question. She only asked that she be allowed to spend 2 months in the hills with her friends, crying over her virginity, the life she would never fully understand, the years she would spend married, and the children she would not have. Her father graciously permitted it, and she left, her days occupied with silent grief and the company of friends who shared her grief. After 2 months, she came back, and Jephthah fulfilled his promise. The weight of the act is evident, but Scripture does not dwell on the specifics, leaving it cloaked in mystery. Jephthah's victory over the Ammonites was forever tethered to the shadow of his vow, and his daughter was gone, sacrificed due to hurried words. Every year, Israel's young women would go to remember her for 4 days. This mourning custom helped to preserve her memory. The story's profound melancholy serves as a reminder that unwise devotion can result in heartache. Raised by God to save his people, Jephthah was a man molded by rejection but brought low by his own hasty pledge. In the fabric of Israel's history, his triumph was genuine, but so was his grief. And in the midst of sorrow, his unnamed but enduring daughter shines like a soft light, her obedience and acceptance shining like a gentle figure of sacrifice. The cycle of tragedy and triumph is repeated in this story. Delivering Israel came at a high price, and there is a whisper for everyone's hearts in the silent retelling of Jephthah's vow, that words have power, that vows made in front of God are sacred, and that hurrying can lead to sadness. Instead of being a shouted warning, it is a gentle lament that echoes like footsteps vanishing into the hills, where Jephthah's daughter used to go to cry. Her footsteps were light but steady as she entered the hills with an almost otherworldly calmness, as though she were moving toward a destiny she had already accepted. The soft rustle of leaves and the soft hum of evening insects filled the cool air. Her friends' voices blended into a gentle chorus of love and sorrow all around her, but she remained unflinching. Even though she was aware of what lay ahead, her spirit remained unwavering. Fear did not consume her soul, nor did bitterness harden her heart. Rather, a silent song, a farewell tune that seemed to emanate from the core of her faith, was carried within her. When her voice rose, it was a soft, comforting sound, like the whisper of a lullaby on the wind, rather than a loud cry of protest or a shout of rebellion. She sang not just for herself, but also for her father, her people, and the God who had saved them from their persecutors. Like water cascading down a mountainside, it was a song of trust and surrender. Even though the words were straightforward, the spirit behind them was enormous and far older than she was. Her song seemed to say, "I was born of your house, Father, and even though my life was brief, it wasn't empty. My hands served your table, my heart was bonded to you with love, and my laughter filled your halls. And now, even though I have to leave, I do so peacefully rather than in rage, because you promised the Lord that you wouldn't break his name. It would be better for my life to be poured out like water than for his name to be dishonored." Even though her companions were crying as they listened, they felt a strange sense of comfort. Her song seemed to envelop them in a tender embrace. transforming grief into a sacred experience. The hills themselves appeared to be listening, reiterating her song in faint undertones, a nearby stream's soft murmur, a dove's call, or the wind's sigh in the branches. Her farewell was more than just a personal mourning. It was incorporated into the chorus of creation, a sacrifice hymn that rose to the sky. With each note she sang during those 2 months, she released her spirit into the atmosphere. She sang about the wedding gown she would never wear, the children she would never hold, and the days she would never see. However, there was only acceptance rather than resentment even in those laments. Her song seemed to whisper, "My path is different. My faith will carry memory, but my womb won't carry life. I plant remembrance where others plant children. I create stories while others create families. My life is given. It is not wasted, like a mother humming over a sleeping child." Her voice occasionally faded into almost complete silence. At other times, it rose steadily as the dawnlight with a gentle strength. Like threads in an unbreakable tapestry, each note contained both beauty and sorrow, courage and grief interwoven. In response, her friends raised their own voices, echoing her refrains until the sound of young women grieving not with wailing cries, but with gentle harmonies filled the hills. Together, they composed a song that would last forever, one that would be recited by Israelite daughters for generations to come, who would revisit this tale year after year to preserve her memory. Her bravery did not come from fighting like her father did, or from making decisions like the judges who came before her. Her bravery was softer and quieter, but it was just as strong. She faced death with calm and faith rather than a sword or shield. She carried the weight of her father's words so that he wouldn't be crushed under them, accepting his vow as though it were her own. And in that acceptance, she displayed a strength that no warrior could match, the ability to trust, to give up, and to voluntarily walk into sacrifice with grace and dignity. Her song appeared to reach its final refrain on the Fainan, last night of her wandering, as the sun slowly sank behind the hills. Her friends huddled together, shedding unrestrained tears, but she broke the tension with a gentle, radiant smile. There was a stillness of peace in her voice, which was hardly more than a whisper. Her melody said, "Do not mourn me as lost. Mourn me as I am. I follow my vow, but my memory is with you, and my spirit is with the Lord. Sing of me in remembrance, not in despair. Allow your voices to take me where my feet are no longer able to go. So they did." When she went back to her father, her posture was one of resolve rather than resistance, and her eyes were filled with calm instead of fear. Her song persisted, enveloping him in its subdued solace even as grief tore at his heart. And her farewell song remained when her life was finally offered. Invisible but indisputable, it was woven into the very fabric of her people's souls and lingered in the air like the aroma of blossoming flowers. Following spring rain, when Israel's young women gathered for 4 days each year to honor her, they did more than just remember her passing. They remembered her song. They carried her sacrifice and faith through the ages by singing her song once more in their own voices. They also became a part of her story, her bravery, and the gentle legacy she left behind through their singing. Not only was the daughter's farewell song her own, but it also became Israel's lullaby, a reminder that love sometimes gives everything subtly and without demanding glory. That courage sometimes whispers instead of shouts, and that faith sometimes calls for gentle sacrifice. Her memory lives on in this. Through her song, she teaches hearts that faith can triumph over fear, and that beauty can be found even in farewell, not as a victim or a shadow, but as a light that shines softly in the dark. Even though her voice is no longer heard on earth, it never really stops singing in the hearts of those who remember it. His story started in the silence of a desolate household yearning for life, in the hush of expectation, before it was full of struggles, puzzles, and strength. History has forgotten the name of a man from the Dan tribe named Manoah and his wife, but his faith endures forever. Her heart prayed for a sign, her arms aching for a child, and she had carried the grief of emptiness for years, as if bearing a secret too sacred to be yelled. A celestial messenger stepped softly into this waiting silence. The angel arrived with gentleness, like the whisper of a dream, rather than with thunder or flame. He spoke words that shone like lanterns in the night to the woman who believed she had been forgotten. The words, "You shall conceive and bear a son," must have sounded like rain on dry land, a long-awaited assurance that had been kept silent for years. However, this child was not like the others. From the moment of his conception, this son would be a deliverer, because he would be a devout Nazirite, and through him, salvation would start to stir for Israel, which was groaning under the weight of the Philistines. His hair was never to be cut. The prophecy rocked her heart with awe and wonder as it hung in the air like a gentle yet potent lullaby. After the angel's visit, picture her lying awake at night, listening to the peaceful sounds of her house, maybe stroking her still empty womb and whispering to herself, a child of promise. Her thoughts would float like clouds, wondering what kind of boy he would be. What would he look like? When he was a baby, what songs would he sing? There was a sense of sacred weight beneath all those gentle inquiries, because this was not just her child, rather, it was a child constrained by divine destiny. Manoah was equally astounded and shaky when she told him. He yearned to comprehend, to hear the directions more clearly. Thus, as though in response to his request, the angel reappeared and repeated the prophecy in front of the husband and wife. She was to abstain from wine and unclean food, because what grew inside her was consecrated, according to the specific instructions. This son would be God's from the moment he was conceived until he breathed his last. The couple's hearts were full of reverence as they stood in awe. Overwhelmed, Manoah sought advice. How will we raise the boy after he is born? Every parent had this question, but in this instance, it had a divine significance. Gently, the angel reminded them to raise him as a vessel for God's power, set apart and holy from the start. Then, in a mysterious and holy act, the angel rose up in the flame of their offering and left in fire. And knowing that the Lord's messenger had come to visit them, Manoah and his wife collapsed on their faces, shaky but reassured. Quiet wonder must have pervaded the nights that followed. The mother's heart served as a cradle before her arms ever joined, and she carried her secret like a treasure. She knew that this child was more than just hers, even though the village around her might not have fully grasped the promise. Every kick was a tiny prophecy realized, and every movement in her womb served as a reminder of heaven's hand. Even before he was born, she must have sung to him softly, lullabies interspersed with prayers, each note containing the wonder of Abba, servant entrusted with destiny as well as the tenderness of a mother. The child was then born in the silence of time. To his parents, his first cry was sweeter than any song they had ever heard, even though it must have sounded like a trumpet in the night. They called him Samson, which means little sun, as if his name itself conveyed light, a brilliance that would one day rage fiercely against Israel's oppressors. Each strand of his unwashed hair served as a reminder of the covenant between heaven and earth, curling as a symbol of his vow. As he grew, the Lord's Spirit started to move within him, not in loud outbursts, but in quiet, almost imperceptible moments. A power felt like a current beneath still waters, but not yet manifested in combat. As a boy, he might have lifted more weight than other kids his age or run remarkably fast. Maybe there was an odd energy in his laughter, a spark in his eyes that caused people to stop. His parents kept a close eye on him, never forgetting the directives, and constantly reminding him that he was unique and should not be influenced by wine or everyday life. But even with the weight of his fate, Samson would have enjoyed the small pleasures of growing up during his early years. He must have experienced the comfort of sitting next to his mother while she told him stories, the warmth of the sun on his face while playing in the fields, and the firm hand of his father guiding him at work. But because Samson's life was a story that had been written before he could read or speak, there was a layer of sacredness like a gentle veil over all these everyday scenes. Telling the tale of Samson's birth is a gentle way of whispering a prophecy, a promise made to a sully nation at night. Israel was exhausted, ensnared by the Philistines' might, and their hearts ached for freedom. And God sowed the seed of that deliverance in a barren woman's tiny house, not with chariots or armies, but with a newborn's cries. God operated in mystery in this way through the unlikely, the fragile, and the unexpected. Later in life, Samson would experience storms, hardships, and setbacks, as well as flashes of wisdom and moments of vulnerability. However, in his early days, all that existed was innocence, promise, and the lullaby of fate. His story began not with a lion's roar, but with a baby's gentle cry. Not with strength, but with weakness, and not with noise, but with silence broken by hope. The first notes of deliverance started to play like a faraway melody in the night, and Israel's future started to change with that cry, with his breath steady and calm. The child of destiny lay in his mother's arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers. In addition to her son, she saw God's faithfulness, the miracle of prayers answered, and the fulfillment of a promise too big for her to fully understand when she looked at him. As he fell asleep, she might have whispered to him, "You are his." Little one. Samson's story started in that silent moment, like a prophecy sung as a lullaby, a promise of greatness rocking softly into the world. You are his. The strength that had quietly sparked inside Samson as a child started to become more apparent as he matured into a man, akin to the distant thunder before a storm. Each strand of his long, uncut hair served as a reminder of the covenant that bound him to God. He was different from the men of his tribe, however, who carried their plows across the land and worked in the fields. Beneath his serene exterior, Samson possessed a strength that was beyond the scope of human perception. In those early days, his story started to sound like folklore, the kind of story told by firelight, where the wind whispers the weight of fate at every pause. A lion unexpectedly bounded toward him, One day, as he was strolling along the paths close to Timnah's vineyards, with its roar tearing through the silence and its claws flashing in the sunlight, it arrived with a rush of power. The majority of men would have run away or froze in terror, but something bigger stirred in Samson. When the Lord's Spirit descended upon him, he grabbed the lion with his bare hands. In a moment that seemed to last forever, he tore the beast apart as if it were a young goat, his arms moving with a force that was not his own. Only Samson's hands, under the guidance of a strength bestowed from above, made contact with the animal. No sword, spear, or other weapon. As if even creation held its breath, the earth fell silent once more after it was finished. With his chest heaving, Samson stood in wonder at what had just transpired as the lion lay motionless on the ground. But he kept it to himself. He didn't shout with joy or boast, carrying the memory in his heart like a secret too sacred and heavy to reveal. He continued to walk in silence. This was not just any victory, though. It was the first significant indication that the Spirit of God would use him in ways that went against the laws of nature. Curiosity pulled him back to the location of the lion's body a few days later when he followed the same route. He discovered an odd marvel. Bees had taken up residence in the beast's carcass, and honey oozed from it, sweet and golden. Something alive, something nourishing, a reminder that sweetness can be found even in the ruins of strength, had emerged from death. Without disclosing its source, he later shared the honey with his parents after scooping it into his hands and tasting it. There was a mystery and a lesson wrapped in simplicity in that silent deed. Strength may destroy, but even destruction can be followed by the peculiar rebirth of life. It was a hint of God's paradox: strength and tenderness, sweetness and ruin, light and shadow intertwined. This incident served as the inspiration for a riddle that Samson would later tell during a feast. The riddle was delivered in the light-hearted, enigmatic manner of someone who understood his story at deeper levels rather than with a voice of pride. When Samson stood up in front of the Philistines, he said, "Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet." The statement baffled them, as riddles frequently do, arousing both curiosity and annoyance in equal measure. For those who were listening, it was merely a game of wit among the banquet tables and a word puzzle. But beneath it, like a secret flame in the dark, was a story of shadows and strength, a story of life emerging from death. Unable to figure out the riddle, the Philistines asked Samson's bride for clarification. As the days went by, their rage intensified like a fire, and at last, with their threats mounting, she begged Samson to tell the truth. Samson's spirit was consumed with annoyance when the riddle was solved because treachery had intruded into what should have been a festive occasion. Even so, this was part of his destiny because the spirit rekindled inside him and pushed him to fight against those who wanted to persecute Israel. Despite being shrouded in mystery and folklore, his early actions served as catalysts for his life's larger conflicts rather than merely being stories of his prowess. Even so, there is a gentleness and a cadence to these tales that resembles the voice of someone narrating them in the silence of the night by a fire. A man selected by God was too strong for a lion to defeat. What was once deadly and fierce now flowed like honey, a riddle that conveyed truth more profound than words. These are whispers, symbols, and shadows of something bigger than simple displays of physical prowess. Samson's early years were characterized by paradox as well as power. Despite being drawn to human frailty, he was a man called to deliver. He was gentle enough to taste the honey dripping from a lion's carcass, but strong enough to tear it apart. In the same way that his uncut hair symbolized his vow, he carried mysteries, riddles, and secrets. These incidents seem less like violent tales in the silent telling and more like parables tucked away in the annals of time. They serve as a reminder that life frequently combines sweetness and strength, triumph and grief, and mysteries and insights. Samson's journey was already indicating that it would not be easy. He was selected, unique, but destined to struggle with himself and those around him. Though powerful, his strength moved in shadows, inspiring and warning, protecting and unsettling. Such stories would be told around the fire with pauses and whispers, allowing listeners to lean in closer, their hearts torn between awe and anxiety. They would taste the honey dripping from an unexpected place, imagine the lion's roar being muffled by human hands, and struggle with the riddle that held both humor and a secret. Samson's fate was being written in these early actions, one action at a time, like a dark path lit only by smoky firelight. The idea that his life was not just his own, but rather a part of a greater mystery, a tale of God's deliverance told in the language of strength and shadows, riddles and promises, sweetness and sorrow also grew as his story did. Samson's life was no longer solely about feasts and riddles when it started to intersect with the Philistines. What had been light-hearted glimpses of his power had now turned into flames that grew larger, fueled by pride, treachery, and deep wounds. His fury is best interpreted as the echo of someone divided between what his heart could not resist and what he was called to be, rather than as the yell of a man consumed by wrath. Though his path frequently led him into entanglements that obscured his vision, his destiny was clear: to free Israel from its oppressors. This gives Samson's rage an odd, surreal appearance, as though it were a fire that was burning both inside and outside of him against his adversaries. The first major rift in his soul was caused by his Philistine wife's betrayal. Samson's heart turned into dry tinder, waiting for the spark of vengeance, when those who ought to have valued his trust instead gave her to someone else. The fire that arose within him was directed not only against the Philistines, but also against the humiliation and disgrace they had inflicted upon him. He selected his weapon from the fields themselves rather than from the men's arsenal. Wild and agitated foxes were captured in pairs, their tails tied together with burning torches. They became living representatives of Samson's wrath after being let loose in the Philistine grain fields, bringing fire into the golden harvests. Promised fields became seas of fire, and smoke billowed into the sky like a sacrifice of devastation. However, this scene takes on a dreamlike quality if we stop and consider it as a part of Samson's life's rhythm rather than an act of blind rage. Imagine fire striations flowing through the fields like rivers of light, illuminating the night horizon. The foxes running around become representations of anarchy and uncontrollable retaliation. The flames dance and consume, flickering as if they were whispering the tale of a man who was unable to find peace. This was no typical conflict. It was a vision of rage turned into a natural force that was uncontrollable, untamed, and oddly depressing. This act infuriated the Philistines, who attempted to strike back. Instead of focusing their ruthlessness on Samson, they set fire to his wife and her family. Sorrow fed rage, and rage fed sorrow as the cycle of retaliation intensified. The conflict between Samson's strength and his weakness also intensified. His heart had been drawn into personal resentment, even though he was supposed to save his people. His triumphs had become entangled with his personal injuries and were not just for Israel. Every act of vengeance carried the shadow of deliverance, and every act of deliverance carried the weight of vengeance. The Lord's Spirit repeatedly descended upon him, giving him unfathomable strength. He defeated the Philistines in large numbers when they attacked him. He once grabbed a donkey's jawbone, a weapon so insignificant and improbable that, in his hands, became a weapon of victory. He struck down 1,000 men with it, and as the bodies fell, the earth's dust rose up around him. But there was no real rest, even in victory. His power was like an unquenchable fire that prevented his soul from ever finding tranquility. However, Samson's humanity emerged when his body ached after the victory. His voice trembled with desperation rather than pride as he prayed to God. "Your servant has brought about this significant deliverance on your behalf. Will I now perish from starvation and end up in the hands of the uncircumcised?" His weakness was exposed in that instant. He was not an invincible stone hero. Rather, he was a man who doubted, thirsted, and hungered. In mercy, God created a hole in the earth, and water began to flow. After drinking, Samson's spirit reappeared. His dependence was quiet and steady, but his victories were loud. But the fires of vengeance never really went out of him. His strength repeatedly increased in reaction to betrayal, rage, and injuries caused by others. His life was characterized by contradictions. He was called to serve as Israel's judge, but his impulses led him into danger. He was passionate, but frequently his passion was tinged with resentment. Although his strength was a gift, it also consumed him. His life contained both beauty and destruction, light and destruction, like the torches fastened to the fox's tails. It is possible to identify the dreamlike pattern these stories carry when they are narrated in the gentle rhythm of the night. Samson is less a symbol of unbridled power and more a reflection of human struggle as he balances his calling and his frailty. Even though his rage is intense, it almost seems like firelight dancing against a cave's walls. Yes, it is destructive, but it also shows us the shadows. He was unable to escape and the outlines of his heart. He never stopped dreaming of his destiny, to free Israel and end the oppressive system. However, his own weakness frequently interrupted the dream. Every act of retaliation included a request for justice, healing, and meaning, sometimes made out loud and other times kept hidden. We can learn from Samson's life that calling and weakness can coexist in the same heart, and that strength without peace burns incessantly. As a result, Samson's vengeful fires shine not only as stories of devastation, but also as representations of his internal conflict. His story is about a man who carried both destiny and flaw, divine strength and human frailty. It is not just about enemies being vanquished. His rage was genuine, but when spoken quietly, it becomes more of a lament than a roar, a sorrow that glimmers in the darkness like firelight, reminding us that even the strongest people are frail and still yearn for peace. There is a chapter in Samson's story that is wrapped in the subdued tones of intimacy and treachery, rather than the clash of swords or the blaze of fire. It is the tale of Delilah, the woman whose hushed words caused Israel's strongest man to be overthrown. This portion of Samson's journey occurs in silence. in the delicate area between trust and dishonesty, in contrast to the roar of the lion. He once tore apart or the crack of a jawbone against an army. The scene is a chamber, not a battlefield, where the words are sharper than any blade and softer than steel. Here, in the soft murmur of love, Samson's heart was revealed, fragment by fragment, until his fortitude gave out. Delilah comes in as a figure of charm, allure, and subtlety rather than as a warrior. Her gentle demeanor belies a purpose honed by those who promised her riches and favor. Unable to defeat Samson's strength in direct battle, the Philistine kings decided to use love to set up a trap. If she could figure out the source of his strength, they would give her silver. The gentleness of a lover's voice and the intimacy of a person sitting next to him and staring into his eyes thus approached the strongest man of his era instead of armies. Instead of using chains, the trap was constructed using repeated, tender questions. Here, Samson, who had not shuddered in the face of lions or soldiers, was exposed. Even the strongest people yearn for affection, the comfort of another person's company, and a place to let go of their troubles. Samson went to Delilah to rest. However, trust can disintegrate like dust if it is in the wrong hands. Delilah repeatedly questioned him about the source of his power. Samson initially tinkered with her inquiries, spinning fictitious responses like strands of mischief. He talked about weaving his hair into a loom, about fresh ropes that had never been used, and about bowstrings that had never been dried. Every time she put his words to the test, he stood up, breaking the cords. Unfazed nevertheless. The distance between them changed with every try. Delilah persisted, veiled in love, but not with rage. Her voice became tearful as she questioned his love and how he could pretend to care for her while keeping the truth from her. Her whispers were powerful, not because they were forceful, but because they spoke to the most vulnerable aspect of the heart, the need to be completely understood. Despite his strength, Samson was exhausted. He yearned for intimacy and trust. Because of his life struggles, the betrayals he had already experienced, and the loneliness of bearing such a heavy destiny. So his resolve, like stone worn by soft rain, started to erode under her incessant words. Picture Samson lounging, possibly half asleep, his heart heavy but mellowed by her presence. Delilah's voice is quiet but insistent, like a lullaby. There is only the silent pressing of a question that is asked repeatedly in the chamber, not the roar of battle. There is a lot of stillness in the air, the kind of silence that unnerves rather than calms. Samson closes his eyes, his thoughts divided between desire and suspicion, between the allure of love and the caution of reason. And he gives way slowly. He tells her about his hair, his prenatal vow, and the Nazirite calling that God has given him. His words flow as a gentle confession, a secret intended for one heart but already exchanged for silver, rather than as a shout. When Delilah hears this, she realizes that the time has arrived. She summons the Philistine rulers, and she has Samson's hair chopped off while he sleeps with his head on her lap. With each strand representing a strand of the covenant that had identified him as chosen, the locks fall silently to the ground. He is now normal, frail, and human as the strength that once blazed through him like fire fades. She yells, "The Philistines are upon you." And the murmurs that had lulled him now become cries of alarm. Samson gets up as before, but his arms are weak. He gives himself a shake, but the spirit that gave him strength is no longer there. He has been depleted and turned over to his adversaries as a result of his faith in Delilah. He is easily captured by the Philistines. They take him away in chains, bind him, and gouge out his eyes. Now, under the guidance of others, the man who once carried city gates on his shoulders falters. The quiet of treachery, the soft sound of shears on hair, and the hushed deceit of whispered words, rather than the cacophony of battle, tell the story of his downfall. It is a melancholy tune that serves as a reminder of how easily the heart can be broken, and how even the strongest people can fall victim to silent betrayal. Nevertheless, a profound human truth can be found in the tenderness of this telling. The reason for Samson's demise was not his lack of authority, but rather his desire for closeness, love, and trust. His heart sought rest in the wrong place, not his arms, which failed him first. This exposes how easily trust can be betrayed and how devastating its loss can be. In doing so, Samson transforms from a symbol of strength gone awry to a reflection of the human spirit, which frequently yearns for intimacy so intensely that it puts everything on the line for it. Therefore, Delilah's whisper is more than just the sound that Samson was deceived by. It represents every brittle tie and every faith entrusted to unworthy hands. It brings with it both grief and caution, compassion and devastation. And in the silence of the night, it is less a story of contempt and more a lament, a gentle song of lament for the lost strength, the untrue love, and the man who wanted to be completely known but ended up undone. The man who had once stood taller than his adversaries was now stumbling with every step, his arms outstretched to feel the air before him as they led him away in silence. His once ferocious and steady eyes had been stolen, and now he was unable to see the way ahead. Infinite darkness now shrouded the world that had once been alive with the sight of lions, flames, and battles. In addition to losing his sight, he had also lost his strength, independence, and the dignity that had once characterized him. However, there is something incredibly human about this fall that speaks of grief rather than condemnation and the frailty of even the strongest of us. This was a moment of joy for the Philistines, who could never defeat him in open combat. Their icy weight pressed against his ankles and wrists as they shackled him with bronze chains. They escorted him into Gaza, the city where he had previously carried their gates on his shoulders, and set them atop a hill. It was a harsh contrast. He was now ridiculed where he had once been feared. His name had once made his enemies shudder, but now it made his captors laugh in the hallways. As a sign that their gods had triumphed over his, they brought him into their temple, not as a man, but as a trophy of their victory. But there was silence in Samson's world despite the commotion of their celebration, the jeers, and the ridicule. Every step he took became uncertain due to his blindness. Every sound grew more acute, the grating of chains on stone, the laughter of onlookers, the far-off cries of victory emanating from Dagon's temple. He was completely humiliated by the tasks assigned to him in addition to losing his sight. In the prison, they put him to work grinding grain, a job only slaves and beasts of burden are allowed to do. Once wielding the jawbone against thousands, his hands now pushed in ceaseless circles against the heavy millstone. The powerful man turned into a worker, enslaved to a cycle of exhaustion. Nevertheless, a silent miracle was already starting inside. This never-ending turning. After being chopped off in treachery, his hair started to grow back. It reappeared strand by strand, day after day, without fanfare, without warning. This was more than just hair coming back. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that God was not done with him and that the covenant had not been broken even in his fall. But for the time being, Samson was still shackled, moving in the dark, and bearing the burden of both his humiliation and his decisions, and how subtly this aspect of his life can be described. For it was profoundly human, even though it was characterized by suffering and humiliation. Many hearts can relate to the experience of falling after pride, stumbling after strength, and discovering that one is weaker than ever. Here, Samson's tale is not one of mockery but of kindness, serving as a reminder that everyone can experience sadness and that even the strongest among us can be brought low. His blindness was more than just physical. It was the reflection of a man who had once had a clear vision of victory, but had long since been blinded by weak decisions and misplaced trust. But something else was happening there, in the prison's silence. He was being shaped by humility, the stirrings of introspection. Inside him were too strong for the chains that bound his body. Every millstone turn turned into a rhythm of remembering, waiting, and living in the quiet of the past. Even though the Philistines were laughing, Samson was learning to hear a different voice in the solitude of his blindness. It was the faint calling of the God who had promised him at birth, not the whispers of Delilah or the cries of his enemies. It's likely that the people who once looked to him as their champion experienced grief and shame. They might have questioned how the man of great strength, the chosen one, could have fallen so far. Perhaps this very lesson, that strength alone is insufficient to carry a soul, was intended to be conveyed through his story. That even the most powerful people require direction, and that even the best talents can become obstacles in the absence of God's guiding hand. A subtle truth can be found in Samson's chains. Even the strongest walls can be brought down by misplaced trust. And power without humility is brittle. Picture Samson sitting in the dark, with chains around his shoulders and his hands grizzled from the constant work. He takes a deep breath, possibly recalling the times when he was as strong as fire, when he had destroyed lions, set fields on fire, and defeated adversaries. But since he is aware of how quickly it all passed, those memories now only bring him grief rather than pride. However, there is a silent solace as his hair brushes against his shoulders once more, indicating that even though he has been abandoned by people, God has not. Even though the Philistines thought they had won, Samson's story did not end there. He started to see differently in his blindness, with spirit instead of eyes. He started to understand the true meaning of strength, not the power of weapons, but the surrender of the heart through his humiliation. His capture marked not only the end of his freedom, but also the start of a more profound journey that would lead him through hopelessness and ultimately to redemption. Thus, rather than being harsh, we linger here with Samson out of compassion. We see him as a soul in development, as someone traveling the long, silent path of humility, rather than as a man who has been ridiculed and broken. His tasks are heavy and low, his blindness keeps him in shadow, and his chains clink with each step. But something sacred is being formed in these very things. Sometimes the greatest strength emerges in the midst of weakness, because it is a representation of humanity itself fallen, broken and humbled, but never beyond the reach of mercy. The image of Samson in chains is not one to be mocked, but to be understood, to be laughed at, but to be grieved. And we wait with him in the silence of this chapter, hearing the soft return of hope in the sound of hair growing back, in the invisible presence of God who has not abandoned us, in the quiet that foreshadows what lies ahead. That day, the temple was a hive of activity, with the clamor of celebration and laughter resonating off the walls. The Philistines had assembled in great numbers, their voices rising in delight and derision, as they gave thanks to their God for the destruction of the man who had once frightened them, with the press of bodies bending forward to view the prize of their victory. Samson, the blinded strong man, guided by a young boy's hand. The air was heavy with wine and incense. He was introduced to them as a spectacle, something for their entertainment, rather than as a warrior or a judge. Every step he took was a reminder of his humiliation as the chains clattered softly. But something that the enemy couldn't see stirred. Behind his closed eyes, out above him, the temple's pillars held up the roof, beneath which thousands of people, both lords and commoners, had assembled. The Philistines saw it as their day of victory, when their god, Dagon, was praised for defeating Israel's powerful judge. But another story was being told in the stillness of Samson's heart. Even though he was blind, he was able to see more clearly in the darkness than he had ever been able to when he had sight. The stone felt heavy and ancient, cold and smooth under his fingers. He somehow knew that God had brought him here, in this place of shame. For one last reason, these pillars were the house of strength. In a low, almost gentle voice, Samson leaned toward the boy who was guiding him and requested to be positioned so that his hands could rest on the pillars. It was the tone of a man who had been broken and reshaped by grief, a voice of quiet request rather than one of command or haughtiness. Unaware that the boy had guided him to the center of the temple's frame, Samson's palms spread out over the chenkung of the stone as if he were taking on the weight of the entire world. And he prayed there, amid the roar of celebration and jeering crowds. It was the gentle entreaty of one who had nothing more to offer than his life, not the clamorous cries of a warrior or the boast of a man seeking glory. He muttered, "Remember me, O Lord God. Just that, keep me in mind." It was the supplication of a spirit that had wandered, stumbled, risen in strength, and fallen in weakness, but now humbly returned to the God who had never really abandoned him. He asked for strength one last time, not for himself, but for the Kenself, honor of the one who had chosen him from birth, and his words carried the silent weight of grief and surrender. His prayer was not audible to the crowd, and even if it had been, they would not have understood it. Samson was a broken man and a symbol of their victory in their eyes. But that prayer, fragile and sincere, rose like incense within the folds of heaven, and God heard it. Unseen but indisputable strength awoke inside him once more. It wasn't his youthful, reckless strength or his irrational outbursts of rage that had once propelled him into combat. This was a more profound strength that had been honed via blindness, loss, and chains. It was power softened by surrender, strength coupled with humility. Samson felt the weight of the roof above him and the tremendous resistance of the stone as he pressed against the pillars. The voices of those who thought the story of Israel's judge had ended in defeat were mocking, and laughter rang out around him. They were unable to see what was going on or hear the soft words that had roused something bigger inside of him. The effort caused his shoulders to strain, his arms to shake, and his body to bend. He was no longer a tall, proud warrior, but rather a man giving his all to this one last deed. The pillars started to move, and the ground trembled under his feet. Though many were too engrossed in their celebration to comprehend, the crowd's laughter transformed into bewilderment and alarm. Samson's chains clattered again, but this time not in surrender. Rather, they sounded like the last notes of a song, the sound of a man fulfilling his mission. The pillars gave way as Samson pushed with all of his heart, all of his strength, and all of the breath still in his lungs. The temple moaned as the weight of its own pride caused the roof to collapse, the stone to split, and the beams to break. It was too late when the crowd let out a terrified cry. The fall engulfed both lords and commoners, the powerful and the ridiculed. Cries arose and fell, dust filled the air, and in the midst of it all, Samson lay buried, his purpose fulfilled, his prayer answered. His last deed transformed his life into a song of redemption rather than just a tale of bravery. As he had requested to be remembered, after the collapse, there was a hush that resembled the quiet that follows a lullaby when the music stops and the heart is the only thing left to beat. Fire and storm, triumphs and setbacks, pride and shame had all been a part of Samson's life. Nevertheless, it ended with a quiet prayer that brought serenity. His death was the silent reclamation of his calling, the gentle return of a man to the God who had selected him before birth, not the victory of his enemies. As a result, Samson's final prayer reverberates through the ages like a gentle echo. It serves as a reminder that there is hope despite weakness, blindness, and the weight of chains. It teaches us that our last words and breaths can be acts of faith, that it is never too late to come back, and that the one who sees with love rather than eyes will always remember us. His tale concludes not with the clash of battle or the roar of lions, but with the silence of surrender and the assurance that his life, despite its brokenness, was never in vain. Samson sleeps in the quiet as the dust settles and the noise subsides. He is no longer bound by his chains. He is no longer defined by his blindness. His purpose has been accomplished and his strength has been poured out. We are left with the picture of a man who, in his final prayer, discovered the greatest strength of all the strength of being, remembered by God, as though the night itself were holding his story. The years that followed Samson seemed to be a shadow extending over the landscape. Israel's heart was not sufficiently anchored by the memory of his last deed, which persisted, whispered around firesides and on the lips of storytellers. The same cycle that had plagued them for generations returned with more weight, and the people drifted again, as if a tether had been severed. They wandered in both physical and spiritual ways because they lacked the strength of a judge to lead them and the wisdom of a leader to call them back to their God. Homes reverberated with the emptiness of uncertainty. Fields were left unguarded, and villages stood exposed. There was no hand steady enough to prevent them from wandering, no unifying voice to remind them of their identity. The land itself seemed to let out a long, tired sigh because of the robbers and raiders who preyed on the division of the populace. The roads became hazardous. Tribes occasionally turned against one another in addition to against outsiders. Each man followed his own moral convictions, and the ties that had bound them together began to unravel. Like old songs that younger ears have forgotten, the great triumphs of Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson faded into distant echoes. Lessons became dull as children grew up hearing bits and pieces of stories without understanding the underlying pulse. The land appeared to be in twilight, as if the light had been turned off. Worship became fragmented. Hilltop shrines arose, and altars to pagan deities coexisted with traces of Israel's devotion to the Lord. The people yearned for blessings, stability, and prosperity, but they found it in the arms of their former captors. Their prayers became dispersed, muttered to unhearing idols, and the silence that followed left them even more hungry. Like the pain of a heart that knows it has lost something valuable but can't quite recall what it was, a profound longing pervaded the air. This was the emptiness of a people who had lost the thread of their purpose and their story. The land seemed to moan under its weight night after night. Seasons changed, rivers flowed, and fields produced crops, but there was no joy. Once bursting with song and dance, the festivals lost the spirit that bound heaven and earth together and became shallow, more ritual than remembrance. Because they were afraid of raiders or arguments, families sat at their tables and spoke quietly. Even the elders, who had previously spoken with assurance, now had doubts in their voices. It seemed as if the country's very essence was coming apart. One thread at a time. Legends of ancient heroes persisted, but their significance had diminished. It sounded more like a dream than a reality when someone mentioned Gideon's 300 men. The story of Deborah beneath the palm tree seemed far away, like a dying star in the night sky. The whispers of Samson's final prayer and the bravery of Jephthah's daughter all appeared to be artifacts unrelated to the difficulties of the present. Despite their longing for deliverance, people lacked the faith to raise their voices in unison. Not only were their enemies pressing down on them, but their hearts were dispersed like wind-blown leaves. Not all the time was the darkness violent or loud. It was often silent. It settled in a farmer's fatigue as he pondered whether his harvest would be stolen. It existed in the quiet of a mother who prayed but no longer thought that her intercession could change heaven. It reverberated in the phony laughter of forced joy at festivals. Not only were there conflicts and absent leaders, but there was also a deeper void that left people aimlessly lost. Though they were sporadic sparks in a vast night, there were times when people rose bravely. There were intermittent minor successes, but no long-lasting peace. As though stability were a dream that always slipped away at dawn, the land appeared to be cursed with transience. Families yearned for safety, for someone to comfort them, but they couldn't find it. With every year that went by, the yearning became more intense, until it seemed as though the whole country was holding its breath, anticipating something that would never arrive. Longing whispered at the periphery of everyday existence. Youngsters questioned their parents about why, unlike the countries around them, their people lacked a king or other leader. When asked why God no longer sent judges to save them, the elders mumbled about the times when he had done so. As a result of this tension, the populace started to envy the order, kings, and armies of their neighbors. Desire for a human ruler who could stabilize what they themselves couldn't was sown. However, even this desire was tinged with emptiness, because it was born out of comparison and longing born out of despair rather than faith. They felt the weight of heaven's silence, even though heaven itself had not become quiet. God was still there, still keeping watch, still hoping that his people would come back. However, years of wandering had dulled their ears, clouded their eyes, and hardened their hearts. The land appeared to be covered by a thick veil of forgetfulness rather than storms or fire. They no longer screamed as they used to. They kept wandering because their prayers were feeble, dispersed, and hesitant. The burden of that wandering weighed heavily on Israel's soul. It was hollow on the inside as well as chaos on the outside. People grasped only shadows, longing for something solid to hold on to. They looked to alliances, idols, and transient pleasures for solace, but they were unsuccessful. Thus, a nation living in twilight, a people searching for their story, and the land remained restless. And he prayed there, amid the roar of celebration and jeering crowds. It was the gentle entreaty of one who had nothing more to offer than his life, not the clamorous cries of a warrior or the boast of a man seeking glory. He muttered, "Remember me, O Lord God. Just that, keep me in mind." It was the supplication of a spirit that had wandered, stumbled, risen in strength, and fallen in weakness, but now humbly returned to the God who had never really abandoned him. He asked for strength one last time, not for himself, but for the Self, honor of the one who had chosen him from birth, and his words carried the silent weight of grief and surrender. His prayer was not audible to the crowd, and even if it had been, they would not have understood it. Samson was a broken man and a symbol of their victory in their eyes. But that prayer, fragile and sincere, rose like incense within the folds of heaven, and God heard it. Unseen but indisputable strength awoke inside him once more. It wasn't his youthful reckless strength or his irrational outbursts of rage that had once propelled him into combat. This was a more profound strength that had been honed via blindness, loss, and chains. It was power softened by surrender, strength coupled with humility. Samson felt the weight of the roof above him and the tremendous resistance of the stone as he pressed against the pillars. The voices of those who thought the story of Israel's judge had ended in defeat were mocking, and laughter rang out around him. They were unable to see what was going on or hear the soft words that had roused something bigger inside of him. The effort caused his shoulders to strain, his arms to shake, and his body to bend. He was no longer a tall, proud warrior, but rather a man giving his all to this one last deed. The pillars started to move, and the ground trembled under his feet. Though many were too engrossed in their celebration to comprehend, the crowd's laughter transformed into bewilderment and alarm. Samson's chains clattered again, but this time not in surrender. Rather, they sounded like the last notes of a song, the sound of a man fulfilling his mission. The pillars gave way as Samson pushed with all of his heart, all of his strength, and all of the breath still in his lungs. The temple moaned as the weight of its own pride caused the roof to collapse, the stone to split, and the beams to break. It was too late when the crowd let out a terrified cry. The fall engulfed both lords and commoners, the powerful and the ridiculed. Cries arose and fell, dust filled the air, and in the midst of it all, Samson lay buried, his purpose fulfilled, his prayer answered. His last deed transformed his life into a song of redemption rather than just a tale of bravery. As he had requested to be remembered, after the collapse, there was a hush that resembled the quiet that follows a lullaby when the music stops and the heart is the only thing left to beat. Fire and storm, triumphs and setbacks, pride and shame had all been a part of Samson's life. Nevertheless, it ended with a quiet prayer that brought serenity. His death was the silent reclamation of his calling, the gentle return of a man to the God who had selected him before birth, not the victory of his enemies. As a result, Samson's final prayer reverberates through the ages like a gentle echo. It serves as a reminder that there is hope despite weakness, blindness, and the weight of chains. It teaches us that our last words and breaths can be acts of faith, that it is never too late to come back, and that the one who sees with love rather than eyes will always remember us. His tale concludes not with the clash of battle or the roar of lions, but with the silence of surrender and the assurance that his life, despite its brokenness, was never in vain. Samson sleeps in the quiet as the dust settles and the noise subsides. He is no longer bound by his chains. He is no longer defined by his blindness. His purpose has been accomplished, and his strength has been poured out. We are left with the picture of a man who, in his final prayer, discovered the greatest strength of all the strength of being, remembered by God, as though the night itself were holding his story. The years that followed Samson seemed to be a shadow extending over the landscape. Israel's heart was not sufficiently anchored by the memory of his last deed, which persisted, whispered around firesides and on the lips of storytellers. The same cycle that had plagued them for generations returned with more weight, and the people drifted again, as if a tether had been severed. They wandered in both physical and spiritual ways because they lacked the strength of a judge to lead them and the wisdom of a leader to call them back to their God. Homes reverberated with the emptiness of uncertainty. Fields were left unguarded, and villages stood exposed. There was no hand steady enough to prevent them from wandering, no unifying voice to remind them of their identity. The land itself seemed to let out a long, tired sigh because of the robbers and raiders who preyed on the division of the populace. The roads became hazardous. Tribes occasionally turned against one another in addition to against outsiders. Each man followed his own moral convictions, and the ties that had bound them together began to unravel. Like old songs that younger ears have forgotten, the great triumphs of Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson faded into distant echoes. Lessons became dull as children grew up hearing bits and pieces of stories without understanding the underlying pulse. The land appeared to be in twilight, as if the light had been turned off. Worship became fragmented. Hilltop shrines arose, and altars to pagan deities coexisted with traces of Israel's devotion to the Lord. The people yearned for blessings, stability, and prosperity, but they found it in the arms of their former captors. Their prayers became dispersed, muttered to unhearing idols, and the silence that followed left them even more hungry. Like the pain of a heart that knows it has lost something valuable but can't quite recall what it was, a profound longing pervaded the air. This was the emptiness of a people who had lost the thread of their purpose and their story. The land seemed to moan under its weight night after night. Seasons changed, rivers flowed, and fields produced crops, but there was no joy. Once bursting with song and dance, the festivals lost the spirit that bound heaven and earth together and became shallow, more ritual than remembrance. Because they were afraid of raiders or arguments, families sat at their tables and spoke quietly. Even the elders, who had previously spoken with assurance, now had doubts in their voices. It seemed as if the country's very essence was coming apart, one thread at a time. Legends of ancient heroes persisted, but their significance had diminished. It sounded more like a dream than a reality when someone mentioned Gideon's 300 men. The story of Deborah beneath the palm tree seemed far away, like a dying star in the night sky. The whispers of Samson's final prayer and the bravery of Jephthah's daughter all appeared to be artifacts unrelated to the difficulties of the present. Despite their longing for deliverance, People lacked the faith to raise their voices in unison. Not only were their enemies pressing down on them, but their hearts were dispersed like wind-blown leaves. Not all the time was the darkness violent or loud. It was often silent. It settled in a farmer's fatigue as he pondered whether his harvest would be stolen. It existed in the quiet of a mother who prayed but no longer thought that her intercession could change heaven. It reverberated in the phony laughter of forced joy at festivals. Not only were there conflicts and absent leaders, but there was also a deeper void that left people aimlessly lost. Though they were sporadic sparks in a vast night, there were times when people rose bravely. There were intermittent minor successes, but no long-lasting peace. As though stability were a dream that always slipped away at dawn, the land appeared to be cursed with transience. Families yearned for safety, for someone to comfort them, but they couldn't find it. With every year that went by, the yearning became more intense, until it seemed as though the whole country was holding its breath, anticipating something that would never arrive. Longing whispered at the periphery of everyday existence. Youngsters questioned their parents about why, unlike the countries around them, their people lacked a king or other leader. When asked why God no longer sent judges to save them, the elders mumbled about the times when he had done so. As a result of this tension, the populace started to envy the order, kings, and armies of their neighbors. Desire for a human ruler who could stabilize what they themselves couldn't was sown. However, even this desire was tinged with emptiness, because it was born out of comparison and longing born out of despair rather than faith. They felt the weight of heaven's silence, even though heaven itself had not become quiet. God was still there, still keeping watch, still hoping that his people would come back. However, years of wandering had dulled their ears, clouded their eyes, and hardened their hearts. The land appeared to be covered by a thick veil of forgetfulness rather than storms or fire. They no longer screamed as they used to. They kept wandering because their prayers were feeble, dispersed, and hesitant. The burden of that wandering weighed heavily on Israel's soul. It was hollow on the inside as well as chaos on the outside. People grasped only shadows, longing for something solid to hold on to. They looked to alliances, idols, and transient pleasures for solace, but they were unsuccessful. Thus, a nation living in twilight, a people searching for their story, and the land remained restless. There was a lot of crying in the Israelite camp that night. At Bethel, their voices rose in shaky prayer as they fell before the Lord. Should we oppose our brothers once more? They inquired, their words faltering under the strain of sorrow. Quietly but firmly, the response was yes. Even though the path of justice wound through more sorrow than they had anticipated, it was not yet finished. Israel marched once more as the second day broke. However, the Benjamites defeated them again, with 18,000 more men succumbing to the ceaseless sword play. Their blood seeped into the ground, and the sound of sorrow filled the air. The dreamlike tragedy of fighting their own kin and failing twice in the process left the 11 tribes reeling, confused and broken, their hearts pierced. The cries in the camp that night sounded like a national lament. They fasted until their bodies shook, wept until their voices broke, and offered sacrifices to the Lord as if pleading with him to remove the veil of grief from their eyes. Even the sound of agony permeated Bethel, where the Ark of the Covenant stood and the priests performed their duties. Should we fight our brothers once more? They sobbed, and while the response was gentle, it was significant. "Go, because I'll give them to you tomorrow." Israel left on the third day, but their approach was different, and their steps were more cautious. By pretending to retreat, they set up ambushes around Gibeah, luring the Benjamites out. Flames rose from the city, smoke curling upward like a dark signal in the sky as Benjamin chased, sure of their strength. The battle's momentum changed when Benjamin's warriors turned and saw their house destroyed. Devastation ensued. Motivated by both justice and grief, the Israelite brothers continued to advance, slaying their relatives until only a small group remained. Their cities were destroyed, their women and children were scattered or killed, and the once proud tribe of Benjamin was reduced to ashes. Even though victory was declared, it tasted bitter because the land was filled with grief rather than triumph. Israel reassembled after the dust had settled, but their eyes were hollow and their voices were broken. They lost themselves, but they had won the battle. They had nearly exterminated a tribe from the covenant family in order to exact revenge for a crime. The subsequent silence, which questioned whether justice could ever be fair when brothers fought brothers, was more weighty than the cries of war. They shed tears for Benjamin. They wept for the blood that had been spilled on their own land, for the cries that would never be heard again, and for the emptiness that pervaded the atmosphere like unclean smoke. And they cried for themselves, knowing that their bond had been severed in ways that would never be fully repaired, and that their unity had been shattered. It was a dreamlike tragedy, a haunting song of sorrow that would reverberate throughout their history, reminding them of the price of turning against their own people. The war within Israel was neither triumphant nor glorious, dot with the hills and valleys bearing the scar of the battle. The land sat in silence, knowing they had done what was required, but still lamenting what had been lost. The people lingered in grief, caught between justice and despair. It was a tale of sorrow rather than triumph, a story of brothers who had swung their swords at each other, and of a country that, in its attempt to mend, had only made its wounds worse. The silence left by the battle had clung to the land like a thick fog, but the dust had long since settled. There was an almost unnatural emptiness where the cries of warriors had once thundered across valleys, as if even the birds were reluctant to sing. Villages that had once been teeming with life were now quiet, their streets littered with ruins of the past, and their doorways left open to the wind. War's scars were still visible on the ground, including deep footprints, the faint remnants of long-gone camps, and the occasional dark stain of blood that was difficult for rain to remove. It was the silence of weariness, of souls too heavy to find words, of hearts too exhausted to cry any more, dot with heavy footsteps, their faces drawn, their voices lowered. The Israelites wandered through this silence. They had battled for justice, but what remained was grief rather than victory. The pain was still there, deep and unrelenting, even after the war was over. Families looked for fathers buried in unmarked graves and for sons who refused to return. Unable to reconcile the memory of brandishing their swords against family, brothers avoided each other's gaze. The silence reverberated in the hollow chambers of their hearts and permeated their very bones. Once fierce and proud, the tribe of Benjamin had been diminished to a shaky remnant. Where families had gathered, there were now only shadows. Where villages had flourished, there were only a few shattered walls left. The country of Benjamin itself appeared to be in mourning, its fields and hills devoid of laughter, its roads paved with sorrow rather than happiness. When Israel saw this desolation, they wept for themselves as well as the almost lost tribe, because they had been hit and were unable to recover as the days went by. The silence developed into a voice of its own, whispering to the populace in eerie and gentle tones. They would stroll through fields that had once produced food, and the only sound they could hear was the wind sighing through barren stalks. The water would shimmer silently, reflecting only the tired faces of the children who had once laughed in the wells they passed. After a war, there was a waiting period between grief and recovery, between brokenness and rebirth, but it wasn't yet peace. Everything was on the line, and there was a delicate silence, similar to the pause between breaths. The sorrow of the people was expressed in words that shuddered with remorse at the elders' meetings. What did we do? Their voices trailed off as if they were in a dream they wanted to wake up from. They lamented the deaths of so many tribesmen and Benjamin's women who had been killed, leaving no mothers to care for the survivors. They wept for Israel's sons who had been killed by their own brothers. There were many unanswerable questions. In the silence, questions that went deeper than battle wounds. But in the midst of the grief, there was also the first hint of tenderness, faint but there. Men shared their bread with those who had none. Women reached out to console widows who were not related to them. And children, despite their silence, clung to one another as if they couldn't be separated. Small gestures were where the quiet started to change, not with the cacophony of revelry, but with the tenderness of mutual sorrow. Like a lamp flickering in the dark, compassion whispered in the silence of mourning. Faint but steady, slowly, reluctantly, the land itself appeared to breathe once more. Green shoots, fragile but resolute, started to push through the soil where wartime fires had burned. Blood-muddied streams started to clear, their waters winding through valleys once more, singing softly. The sky, which had previously appeared to be thick with smoke and grief, expanded once more in the subdued hues of dawn and sunset, as if to remind the people that despite the world's brokenness, it was still moving toward rebirth. Nature covered the scars with life rather than erasing them. People started the arduous task of mending in the villages. Stone by stone, broken. Walls were restored, but the sound of hammers and chisels was muted, more like a prayer than work. Fields were sown again, but this time, hands shook as they pushed seed into the ground, uncertain whether happiness would return with the harvest. In homes that had been dark for too long, women lit lamps, their flames tiny lights against the darkness of grief. While the silence persisted, it became softer and less oppressive, resembling a blanket gently placed over the land's wounds. Laughter was first revived by children who had the gift of forgetting more readily. Their tentative games started to reverberate softly through the deserted streets. A song hummed under breath, a race started, a stone tossed. These sounds rose hesitantly, as if uncertain whether the silence would allow them, and the people felt something stirring inside of them when the silence did not fight back, but instead let their voices linger. Life was coming back, tentative and frail. The silence was most intense at night when everyone was sleeping. Memories of the battle were most vivid in the dark, with the faces of the lost hovering just out of reach and the cries of the fallen reliving in their minds. However, even during these hours, the silence started to become softer, more like a watchful presence than a burdensome weight. Some found the strength to hope that healing might one day be possible in the light of the stars. which shone as they always had quiet and unwavering. After a war, there was no forgetting. It was neither the denying of loss nor the erasure of grief. It was the area where sorrow was contained, the gentle pause that made it possible for wounds to start healing. It was the quiet after the storm, when the ground was still shaking, but the sky was clear, and the heart was still hurting but was starting to beat with a slender rhythm of hope. It was the silence of a country discovering through tears what it meant to be broken and what it might still mean to be whole. Peace gradually started to permeate the fabric of existence, even though the silence persisted, softly like the dawn, breaking over the horizon, but not loudly or with a lot of fanfare. Because memory was imprinted on every stone, field, and soul, the people never forgot. However, they started breathing again in the midst of the silence, and as they did so, the promise of tomorrow subtly materialized. The people moved as if they were torn between dream and memory in the silence that followed the protracted years of unrest. Their fields produced fruit once more, but each harvest seemed to bring a reminder of the wartime famine. As children grew, their laughter filled the voids left by loss, but beneath that sound, there was always a hint of longing, a desire for something more solid, something more permanent than the shaky peace they now shared. There were whispers, faint as a breath against the night, that the days ahead would bring something different in the stories that were told around evening fires, when shadows stretched across the land and in voices mellowed by age and grief. After a war, the quiet was not void. Rather, it served as a breeding ground for prophecies. Elders spoke of unfulfilled promises and a future in which the disparate tribes' strength would be united under a single banner. Like a lullaby for a restless people, their words were soft, murmurs rather than declarations. They believed that the God who had delivered them in battle and carried them through the wilderness had not abandoned them, even though they were unsure of how or when it would happen. These rumors stirred the people's hearts because, while they feared kings, think of the Pharaoh of Egypt and the tyrants of Canaan, they also yearned for a leader who could bring their brokenness together in harmony. Men and women would look up at night under starry skies, wondering what was written there. The patterns of the constellations told stories older than memory, as if they were changing with meaning. Some perceived a faint, glistening crown-like shape in them, as if heaven itself were painting the promise of what was to come. These were whispered by shepherds standing guard in desolate fields, and their children would hear them like secrets. With eyes heavy from sleep, the children would tuck the words into their dreams as they said, "One day, a king will rise from among us, chosen not by men but by the hand of God himself." The land itself appeared to be preparing the path, moaning and anticipating an undiscovered fullness. As if protecting a secret buried deep within their stones, the hills of Judah stood silent, as if to remind the people that life goes on and that something bigger is carried downstream. The rivers sang in gentle tones of continuity as they wound their way through valleys, with their branches bending with fruit. The olive groves whispered in the evening breeze, and the people could almost hear the faint footsteps of tomorrow in their shadows. The priests in Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located, cared for their lamp of God, maintaining its flame throughout the long nights. As a sign of vigilance and anticipation, the light from that lamp softly spilled into the night, as if the sanctuary's very curtains were quivering under the weight of things not yet seen. The quiet hum of expectation permeated the atmosphere for those who had come to pray. In addition to expressions of grief and gratitude, the prayers there contained an unsaid request for direction, for a leader, for a shepherd who could wisely and powerfully watch over the flock of Israel. Prophecy voices whispered, not yet thundering. They arrived in dreamers' whispered voices, in mothers' whispers as they held their children, and in farmers' half-spoken prayers as they planted seeds. Instead of discussing names or dates, they expressed their conviction that history had not come to an end and that God was still working on something throughout their time. In this sense, prophecy stirred the leaves of a people still fragile from grief, more like a gentle breeze than a trumpet's call. Travelers reported seeing visions during sleepless nights at the outskirts of villages. A throne, vacant but radiant, had been spotted by some, awaiting the person who would occupy it. Others saw a shepherd's staff in their dreams, raised high above the ground and used to lead flocks that had previously fled in terror. Others described a tree that was planted in arid terrain with deep roots and broad branches that provided shelter to numerous people. Although they weren't official declarations, they spread like fragile songs, going from mouth to mouth and carrying on the breath of the tired, even though they didn't always understand. The words comforted the Israelites as they listened, because there was a guarantee that their story was not finished in those whispers. Despite its scars, the land was not abandoned. Despite their brokenness, the people weren't left behind. There was promise in the silence that had seemed heavy with loss. According to the elders, a new chapter would emerge for Israel. Just as dawn follows the longest night as the embers of campfires burned low, parents would draw crowns, scepters, and shepherd staffs in the dust for their children. They would smile tenderly and say, "Perhaps you will live to see it. Perhaps it will happen when your kids grow up." The children would close their eyes to the lull of such words, carrying visions of shepherds and kings into the world of dreams, where time bends and the future feels close. However, it will come because God has not left us wandering forever, and the people saw gentleness and strength in those dreams. They envisioned a leader who would both lead them into combat and bandage their injuries. A leader who would hear the poor people's cries, help the oppressed, and act as a father figure to the country in addition to being a warrior. The whispers carried a warmth that lessened the pain of the present, but they did not paint a face or a figure. It was hope fragile and delicate, but resilient enough to endure across generations. The wind carried these murmurs like a secret song in the silence of the nights. The whispers of prophecy traveled across hills, valleys, and forests, uniting tribes and fusing their disparate tales into a single common desire. Everyone sensed the promise, like a seed buried deep in the ground, silent but alive, waiting for its appointed time. Even though no one could predict when it would be fulfilled, prophecy grew in the emptiness that followed battle, the grief that followed loss, and the silence that followed war. It was sufficient even though it spoke softly, like a promise in the darkness, because the people found rest in those whispers, and rest gave them the strength to continue walking toward the dawn that had not yet arrived, but would undoubtedly arrive. The people felt an unquenchable longing in the silence following years of turmoil. They plowed their fields and reared their families, but beneath the mundane cadence of existence was a profound pain, a desire for a shepherd to lead them. Although every household had its head and every tribe had its elders, the Nations' threads were dispersed and frayed at the edges. They recalled the days when judges had risen, when the Spirit of God had moved men and women to save them from peril. However, the triumphs of these heroes were always fleeting, like sparks that flickered briefly before fading away in the night. Israel yearned for a long-lasting, reliable person who could not only lead but also save. Not only command in combat, but also protect the people's delicate hearts. Like hunger that no food could sat, it was a desire that awoke in every generation. Early in the morning, farmers prayed in whispers as they planted seeds, requesting guidance on their journey as well as rain and harvest. While their hearts longed for a leader who would protect their future, mothers' voices lulled children to sleep with echoes of longing. Elders sat at village gates and spoke in low voices about unity and the hope that one day they would be united as one people under one shepherd rather than tribe against tribe. Innumerable minor ways were affected by the lack of such leadership. Neighbors got into arguments, and even when they were resolved, the calm always seemed fleeting. Tribes quarreled over territory and borders, and their agreements shook on the verge of disintegrating. Outside their boundaries, enemies awoke uneasily, eagerly observing Israel's divisions, without a single voice to unite them or a steady hand to direct their steps. Each threat served as a reminder of how exposed and helpless they felt. They were uneasy not only because they were afraid of war, but also because they realized how much their hearts yearned for direction and how much their land yearned for rain. This desire was human and ageless, not to mention ancient. In the same way that Israel looked for a shepherd, people of all ages look for stability and purpose. Just as a flock becomes restless when the shepherd's staff is absent, the heart becomes restless when it wanders aimlessly. People still experience the same pain in quiet moments today, the need to be guided towards something bigger, to find meaning in the midst of uncertainty, to find order in chaos. The contemporary soul whispers questions into the darkness, much like Israel's cry rose in the stillness of their nights. Who will guide me? Where am I supposed to be? What does my path mean? Though not always expressed verbally, these whispers frequently surfaced during the time of Israel in prayer. They were occasionally conveyed through silent sobs by people who felt the weight of a lost nation, through gazes raised toward the hills where guards stood, and through sighs too heavy to express. People sought stability, someone who could keep them together when their own strength failed, rather than wealth or power. In the fields, they recalled shepherds men with staffs and crooks who carefully led their sheep to pastures and shielded them from wolves. Their hearts were imprinted with that vision of security and guidance, and they yearned for a shepherd like that for themselves, someone who would not desert them when peril approached. Since they were aware of the price of living without direction, their desire grew stronger. They had witnessed what transpired when everyone followed their own moral convictions. They had witnessed the mayhem, the treachery, and the conflicts that resulted from arrogance and obstinacy. They were aware of how exhausting it is to fend for yourself without a map or a star to guide you. Thus, in addition to desire, their longing was fueled by memories and lessons etched in scars and wounds. There were still echoes of grief in every village, and those echoes heightened their fervent prayers for direction. They secretly thought that God was still listening to them and had not abandoned them. However, they also sensed the silence and separation between His magnificent deeds of salvation. They pondered when he would raise another person who would share their fears and fight their battles. Their prayers blended longing and remembrance to create gentle songs of hope that resembled lullabies. They prayed for a shepherd who would walk among them as one of their own, steady and strong, gentle yet firm, and who would not rule with an iron hand or arrive with cruelty. This same yearning persists even in the contemporary world. It is evident in the hunt for dependable leaders who can preserve communities without taking advantage of them. People who look for mentors, guides, or even spiritual truths to ground their lives experience it in their own journeys. The desire for security and a dependable shepherd is ingrained in human nature and is not limited to Israel's history. The silent questions that are whispered in homes and hearts today are echoed by the ancient cries of a people in fields and villages. The need for direction is as old as the stars. Israel waited, unsure of the form their shepherd would take. Would he arrive brandishing a sword? Would he arrive as a prophet with words more abrasive than steel? Or would he arrive as a servant, caring for the populace with the same attention to detail that a shepherd gives to his flock? All they could do was wait and allow their desire to grow into hope. And there was rest in that hope, a tenuous calm that kept them going despite the uncertainty. Because even though longing is painful, it also holds a sort of promise. To be hungry is to think that there is food, and to be thirsty is to think that there is water. And to yearn for a shepherd is to trust that God will provide one when the tried one, when the tinion for a shepherd is to trust that God will provide one when the tinaid ones in one tie. Time is right dot. So the Israelites lived between hope and sorrow, between promise and memory. They sowed seeds in their prayers as well as the ground, hoping that both would eventually produce fruit. Their songs carried their longing into the night, delicate yet resilient, rising like incense. Even though the shepherd had not yet arrived, their desire itself served as a sort of guide, keeping them focused on the horizon and anticipating the day when God's chosen one would rise to take them home, speaking softly and recalling it in the Tia. Silence of the night. The story of Israel carries with it the rhythm of a cycle that recurs repeatedly, much like the seasons. With songs of thanksgiving and pledges of loyalty, the people would rise in hope and tilt their hearts toward God. However, as the years went by and the ease of tranquility numbed their memories, their gaze strayed elsewhere. They forgot the one who had freed them from slavery and given them life, and instead pursued other gods, aiming for what appeared simpler or more obvious. As a result, their unity broke down, their strength waned, and their adversaries arrived to undermine them. They cried out for mercy when the weight of their decisions became too much to bear, and God, who was patient and unwavering, listened. He raised up deliverers who served as constant reminders of His love and strength. It was a pattern, a recurring circle woven into their history, where grace was the answer to failure and frailty was met with mercy. This cycle involved relationships as well as punishment. God's people wandered off, seeking diversions and losing sight of the security of home, much like kids. However, the Father's arms swung open to embrace them each time they cried and fell. It was the compassion of a shepherd who, despite being tired of pursuing lost sheep, could not leave them in the hands of wolves. Even though every return was tarnished by the dust of wandering, God's mercy persisted and did not wane with repetition. Therefore, The story of Israel is less about their shortcomings and more about his faithfulness, less about their heart's stubbornness and more about his unwavering kindness. It is easy to shake our heads at their repeated errors and question how they could have forgotten the blessings showered upon their land, the victories they had won, and the miracles they had witnessed so quickly. However, we frequently discover the same pattern etched into our own lives when we stop and examine ourselves. How many times have hearts strengthened during happy times only to falter as the shadows grew longer? How frequently do people vow to change after adversity, only to revert to their old behaviors once comfort returns? The eternal cycle belongs to humanity as well as to Israel. It tells the tale of the restless, itinerant human heart that yearns for home and mercy. Even though the cycle may seem painful, its beauty is found in the mercy that always awaits at the end. God is not as tired as we are. He is more patient than human endurance can imagine. He does not grow weary of forgiveness where others do. He still leans in with open arms where we might turn away after failing repeatedly. Instead of lessening his love, the cycle makes it even more evident. Every return and every call for assistance is handled with the same kind decency. The never-ending cycle serves as a reminder that we are always within his reach, even when we fail. Additionally, the cycle reflects growth. Every time the circle rotates, a remnant of the previous one is left behind, much like seasons. Although winter gives way to spring, new fruit is produced by the soil that has been enhanced by previous rains. The same is true for Israel and us. Every fall leaves a mark, every stumble imparts wisdom, and every return deepens one's understanding of mercy. Even though it might seem like we are moving in circles, God uses those circles to create a spiral that gradually and patiently raises us toward his goal. What feels like failure is frequently a part of a longer journey of becoming, and what appears to be repetition is frequently a deepening. This reflection is intended to be consoling rather than burdensome for the listener who is sleeping in the silence tonight. Every heart has its own cycle, with periods of joy and sorrow, strength and weakness, and faith and doubt. On certain days, when the light is clear and fresh and the way forward is obvious, it feels like dawn. On other days, when shadows approach and steps falter in the dark, it feels like dusk. The same truth, however, endures throughout it all. God's mercy endures despite our own resolve. The larger cycle of grace always meets the cycle of failure. Consider the moments in your own life when you made a decision to change and prayed in private that you would never turn back, only to make the same mistakes again. Even though those times are painful, they are reminiscent of Israel's history. But also recall the moments when you were lifted, carried, and pardoned in spite of your missteps. That is also the story of God and the story of Israel, because at its core is an unwavering love. The eternal cycle is one of hope rather than despair. This truth is comforting in its repetition and gentle in its rhythm, much like a lullaby. Hearts are steadied by remembering that mercy never runs out, just as children are soothed by repeatedly hearing the same gentle tune. The cycle is a reminder that we are seen, known, and loved. Each repetition is a new verse in the song of grace. The chorus of mercy gets louder even when failure is repeated, until the song becomes the very air we breathe. When viewed in this context, the story of Israel is one of unending mercy rather than unending mistakes. Yes, the people wandered, but they were never left behind. Yes, they did fall, but they were always raised. They were never forgotten.
This is not merely history.
It is the rhythm of every heart yearning for peace and the pattern of every soul searching for God. The eternal cycle serves as a reminder that God is always waiting, regardless of how many times we return, rather than a trap. Thus, let the story gently rest like a promise on the heart as it is carried into the night. Even with its setbacks and tears, your cycle is a tale of faithfulness, His, not yours, rather than one of failure. Every wheel turn and every return to Him offers an opportunity to learn more about the breadth of His love. Every time you rise, again, you get closer to His embrace, to the serenity you seek, and to the shepherd who never allows his flock to stray from His call. So even though the cycle may repeat, it is never the same. The narrative has meandered through mountains and valleys, through the ascent and descent of a people who were both chosen and frail, both uplifted and lowered. Men and women called in unexpected ways to remind Israel that God had not forgotten them, and we started with their whispers. We witnessed both the heights of bravery and the depths of weakness during their journeys, and their names and actions, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, came to life in subdued tones. The land itself appeared to change in response to their decisions, growing during times of faith and withering during times of forgetfulness. Every time the cycle recurred, it served as a reminder that even though people made mistakes, God's mercy never ran out. The narrative has focused more on the steadfast faithfulness of the one who walked with His people, even when they wandered, far than it has on triumphs and setbacks. We feel the weight of a land in darkness, a people seeking light, as the voices of the judges diminish and the sounds of battles become quieter. They cried out not only for protection from their enemies, but also for a king, a shepherd, or a guide who could keep them afloat. Nevertheless, a promise of something future, a kingdom not based on shifting sands, but on the firm foundation of God's plan, was whispered through the night air, even in the silence. There was a lull in between chapters, a time when desire intensified. We all yearn for stability, peace, and meaning in our own restless moments. So there is something familiar in that longing. Every stage of this journey has served as a reminder of the vulnerability of the human heart. The difficulties we identify in ourselves are reflected in Gideon's doubts, Jephthah's vow, and Samson's divided soul. However, despite their shortcomings, we have seen instances of unwavering bravery, selflessness, and faith. Samson's last prayer, Deborah's wise words, and Jephthah's daughter's silent courage all shine like embers in the soft, dark lights that never stop reminding us that God is able to work even in our weakness and in our grief. These are reflections of our own lives, not merely folk tales. They reassure us that grace is there for us in every season and speak softly of our hopes and fears, our failures and desires. The heart should now rest as the story does. A gentle blessing is left behind as the voices that got us through these storytelling evenings fade into silence. I hope these words bring you comfort as well as history, listener. May Israel's hardships serve as a reminder that you are not fighting your own battles alone. May their return to God serve as a reminder that mercy is always there, no matter how far you've wandered. And as you drift toward rest, may the promise of something bigger yet to come, of a kingdom, of a shepherd, of peace fill your heart. with silent hope with recurring themes of falling and rising, straying and returning. The cycle we have followed through the judges' lives is also a kind of lullaby. Its refrain of mercy makes it a song that never gets old. Let that refrain wash over you tonight as you lie down and take deep breaths. Let it serve as a reminder that God is writing your story as well, and even though it may seem like circles, at times He is transforming it into something eternal and much more beautiful. You are being gently and faithfully guided toward His embrace. You are not imprisoned in your shortcomings. Thus, we end with peace rather than a harsh conclusion. May your soul be calmed as the last remnants of this story fade into the night. I hope your worries start to fade. May the knowledge that God's story is far from over bring peace to your frequently restless heart. It still goes on in you, in history, and in the world. You are now steadied by the same hand that carried Israel through storms. Tonight, you are surrounded by the same mercy that lifted the broken. Let this gentle blessing linger over you before we part ways. May you sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that you are never alone. May you discover your quiet spot where God's presence envelops you like a cozy blanket. Just as Abraham found rest beneath the stars, Gideon found strength in weakness, and Samson found redemption in his last prayer. I hope you have peaceful dreams, steady breathing, and a calm heart. And when you awaken once more, may you do so knowing that His story continues and that you are a part of it. I encourage you to express if these stories have calmed you, moved you, or provided you with rest. This cycle of storytelling is maintained by a simple, kind remark or silent act of subscribing, which may allow others to find solace in these words as well. Your presence has been a part of this journey, and your voice matters here. The timeless rhythm of God's Word unites us as a community of listening hearts. So, may you be blessed as the story comes to an end and the night grows darker. May your spirit be free to breathe in the presence of peace. May your mind relax from its anxieties, and may the burdens you carried today be laid aside. Know this, dear listener, and go to sleep. God's story is not limited to the words of the Taiko, past, or the rise and fall of nations. It also continues in you. Rest in the knowledge that His hand is writing on your life with the same faithfulness, mercy, and love that have led His people from the beginning. And may you find deep, undisturbed sleep in that assurance until dawn.